The radio stopped working at 2:47 in the morning. I remember because I looked at my watch, one of those old luminous dial things that still glows in the dark after 40 years. The silence that followed was not the absence of static, it was something else. Something that pressed against my eardrums like the cabin pressure dropping in a slow, deliberate descent. My name is not important to this account. What matters is that I held the position of Regional Patrol Coordinator for the Taya Inlet Conservation Area, which means I was responsible for monitoring 17,000 acres of Alaskan wilderness, where the mountains rise up like the bones of something buried, and the forests grow so thick that sunlight becomes a rumor. What I am about to document happened in that place. What I witnessed cannot be rationalized by wind or misidentification, or the tricks that isolation plays on the mind. The season had been strange that year, not in the dramatic sense that gets reported in the media, but in the quiet, accumulative way that changes a place from within. The bear activity was lower than usual. The eagle migrations arrived 3 weeks late. Hikers reported feeling watched along trails that had been considered safe for the past decade. None of this should have been enough to trigger an official request for a ranger reinforcement team. But then Robert Wilson arrived at my station with his deteriorating grip on professional composure. Robert was 47, though his face that particular morning had aged him by another 10 years. He worked the northern perimeter routes, maintaining the marked trails that tourists and occasional researchers used to penetrate deeper into the park. His boots were still mud-caked from his last patrol, and he had not changed out of his ranger uniform before driving the 30 miles down the mountainside to find me. I remember asking him if something had happened to one of the marked trails. He stood in my office for nearly 3 minutes without speaking. The silence stretched. I do not remember checking my watch that time, but I felt every second pass like a vehicle rolling over my chest. He told me that he had found prints. Not bear prints, not moose, not the occasional lynx track that still appeared in the deepest winter snow. He told me they were enormous, and they had followed the trail he was supposed to be maintaining. They had not simply crossed it. They had paralleled it for nearly 8 miles, always 50 or 60 feet into the tree line, where the walker would be completely hidden from anyone using the established route. The prints themselves were roughly 22 inches long. The stride length was nearly 6 feet. Robert had photographed them, though he warned me that the images did not convey the depth of the impression in the soil. He said you could fit your hand into them. I called William Rodriguez. William was 63 and had worked in Alaskan wilderness management longer than anyone active in the region. He had handled situations involving aggressive bears, unstable cliff collapses that threatened hiking infrastructure, and a documented wolverine that had attacked 2 research assistants. William had a quality of calm that I envied. When I told him about the prints, he was quiet for a longer time than Robert had been quiet, but his quiet felt different. It contained recognition. He drove up that same day. He brought with him equipment that I had not requested, additional motion-sensitive cameras, a motion detection audio recording system, and an infrared thermal imaging unit that was the kind of equipment parks rarely allocated to regional stations. I asked him where he had acquired it. He told me that it had been in his truck for 6 years, just in case. Just in case of what? I asked him. He would not elaborate. Amanda Clark arrived the next morning. She was a specialist in animal behavior and migration patterns, working on a grant that involved tracking the dietary habits of apex predators within protected wilderness areas. She was 36 and had published research on the movement patterns of wolves and their impact on regional ungulate populations. She was also, I would later learn, deeply familiar with historical documentation of unidentified hominid sightings in the Pacific Northwest. She had requested access to our records immediately upon arrival. It took me approximately 4 hours to locate the proper filing systems. The files were extensive. Dating back to 1976, there were documented reports of unusual vocalizations in the Taya Inlet region. Between 1982 and 1991, there had been a cluster of incidents involving damage to research equipment and emergency shelters. Footprints similar to Robert's discovery had been noted in 1987, again in 1995, and once more in 2003. Every incident had been officially cataloged as either bear activity or the work of transient vandals. None of it had been connected. None of it had been investigated with the kind of seriousness that William had brought with him in the back of his truck. Ashley Martinez was the second ranger posted to the northern perimeter routes. She was 47, the same age as Robert, though where Robert carried the weight of confusion, Ashley carried the weight of someone who had begun to suspect that they knew exactly what they were dealing with. She had arrived at her station on the morning of Robert's visit, had seen the tracks before he had photographed them, and had already begun to leave her own impression on the investigation. She had marked the location on a topographical map. She had set up a simple motion detection camera at the terminus of the trail system. Most importantly, she had done something that none of the rest of us had thought to do. She had recorded the sounds that sometimes came from the forest at night. She had been doing so for the past 2 years, just as a hobby, just out of curiosity. The four of us sat in my office at 11 p.m. on the second day of this expanded investigation. I played Amanda's assessment first. She told us that no known animal of North American origin could produce footprints of the dimensions that Robert had documented. She told us that the stride length and walking pattern suggested a biped, an upright walker, something that moved through the forest with deliberate purpose. William nodded, as if she had confirmed something he already knew. Robert gripped the edge of his chair as if he was afraid it might attempt to move independently. Then I played Ashley's audio files. The vocalizations began with a sound like wind moving through a canyon, but sustained, deliberate, and containing a quality that wind does not possess, a modulation, a complexity that suggested intentional communication. The sound rose and fell, it repeated. There were silences, as if whatever was producing the vocalizations was waiting for a response. In one recording from 3 weeks prior, another sound had responded, a different pitch, a different frequency, a conversation conducted in a language that did not belong to anything that was supposed to exist in these forests. William leaned back in his chair. He said that we needed to establish a monitoring station in the deep forest. He said that we needed to place multiple cameras along the established routes. He said that we needed to document everything, photograph everything, record everything, and most importantly, he said that we needed to do all of this without alerting the creature to our intentions. Robert asked if he actually believed that the thing was intelligent enough to understand if we were trying to monitor its movements. William did not answer the question. His refusal to answer was an answer in itself. 5 days of preparation followed. We established a primary monitoring station at the location where Robert had discovered the footprints. The cameras were positioned to capture any movement along the trail system and into the surrounding forest. The audio recording equipment was set to activate on motion detection. The infrared system was calibrated by William with a precision that suggested he had done this before. On the night of the 5th day, we settled into the ranger station with our monitoring equipment arranged around us. The displays showed nothing but forest. The audio monitors captured only wind and the nocturnal sounds of smaller animals. William sat with his hands folded on the table in front of him. He looked like someone waiting for a train that he had been expecting for a very long time. The incident occurred at 3:14 a.m. The motion sensor at the perimeter station triggered first. An alert appeared on the central display. William moved with a speed that contradicted his age. He was already pulling up the video feed before anyone else had even registered that the alarm had activated. The image showed the trail, exactly as it had appeared during all the previous hours of monitoring. Exactly as it had appeared, that is, until something moved into the frame from the left. The word I have used to describe this moment in my official reports is substantial. It is the only term that seemed professional enough to document in a record that would eventually require submission to regional headquarters. But the word I think when I allow myself to remember the moment without filtering it through institutional vocabulary is wrong. Massive, towering, a shape that consumed the frame, though it did not appear to be attempting to hide from the camera. It simply was. It existed in the space where the trail terminated and the true forest began. What we saw was covered in hair. The color was dark brown, nearly black, with lighter streaks along what appeared to be the shoulders and chest. The head was unusual in a way that was difficult to articulate. It was not quite a skull. It was not quite the head of any animal that any of us had ever encountered. The face seemed to possess both a prognathism, a forward projection of the jaw, and a height of the cranium that suggested intelligence, a complexity. The eyes were not illuminated by the infrared system in a way that suggested reflectivity. The creature was not burning with heat signature like a mammal should. It appeared almost translucent in the thermal imaging, as if it was part of the forest itself, as if the forest was showing through it. It stood on the trail for 47 seconds. We counted each one. Then it raised its head, and though the audio monitoring system was distance away from the primary station and should not have captured sound at that range, it did. A vocalization, deep, resonant, a sound that felt like it was originating from somewhere beneath the earth itself. Then it was gone. The camera continued to record the empty trail for another 17 minutes before William disabled the system. He looked at Amanda. He looked at Ashley. He looked at Robert. He looked at me. And he told us that we were going to have to go into the forest, not during the day, during the night. When it was most active, Robert stood up and walked out of the station. He did not speak. He did not return that evening. When I drove to his residence the next morning, I found it empty. His personal vehicle was in the garage. His uniform was hanging in his closet, and there was a note on the kitchen table in his handwriting that simply stated, "I cannot continue. I am sorry." This was the first of the disappearances. William did not seem surprised by Robert's departure. He informed us that we would expand the monitoring network deeper into the forest, establishing secondary and tertiary stations along the ridge lines and at the junctures where streams met the larger tributaries. He told us that the creature was clearly intelligent, clearly intentional in its movements, and clearly aware of human presence in its territory. The next phase of the investigation required us to move beyond passive monitoring into active engagement. Those were his exact words, active engagement. We split the work. Ashley maintained the primary monitoring station and reviewed the footage. Amanda analyzed the audio recordings, attempting to identify patterns in the vocalizations, attempting to discern if there was linguistic structure that could be translated or at least understood. William and I ventured into the forest with the secondary camera systems, establishing monitoring points along the paths where Robert had found the footprints. The forest in that region of Skagway has a quality that photographs cannot capture. The trees are ancient and so large that a single trunk would take a team of people with linked arms to encircle. The canopy is so complete that even in midday, the light is reduced to a green dimness, as if you are moving through water. The sounds are different from other forests. There is something about the topology, the way the mountains rise and create their own weather systems, that produces a particular acoustic quality. Every sound echoes differently. Every voice reaches differently. On our third day of interior monitoring station installation, William stopped walking. I remember asking him if he had seen something. He said no. He said he was listening. I asked him what he was listening to. He said that he was listening to what was not making a sound. The forest, he said, had gone quiet. All of the smaller animal vocalizations had ceased. The birds were not singing. Even the wind seemed to have reduced itself to a minimum murmur. An hour later, we found the stream where we were supposed to install the tertiary camera. The stream was narrow, only 6 or 7 feet across, moving at a moderate pace downslope. On the far bank, there was a clearing where the forest seemed to draw back from the water, creating a small meadow space. In that space, there were footprints, dozens of them, overlapping, suggesting multiple visits over an extended period of time. Some of the prints were the size of the ones that Robert had documented. Some were significantly smaller. William crouched beside them and ran his fingers across the soil without actually touching the impressions. He told me that these were old, not weeks old, not months old, years old. This place, he said, was a gathering site. This was where they came to meet. This was where they congregated. I asked him who they were. He did not answer me. Instead, he began to set up the camera, selecting an angle that would capture both the clearing and the forest edge behind it. When he was finished, he told me that we needed to return to the station. The walk back took us 40 minutes longer than the walk in, though we were traveling through the same forest on the same path. When I asked him why it was taking longer, he did not answer. His pace, however, became faster, and he never looked back. That evening, Amanda called a meeting. She had been analyzing the audio recordings on a frequency spectrum that William had suggested. When you filtered out the lower frequencies and examined only the higher register vocalizations, she had discovered something, a pattern, a structure. The creature was not making random sounds. It was making specific sounds at specific intervals. It was creating a sequence. It was sending a message. And it was waiting for a response. She told us that similar patterns had been documented in historical recordings dating back to 1987. The patterns were remarkably consistent. The intervals were remarkably similar. Whatever this creature was, it had been attempting to communicate using the same method for over 30 years. Ashley mentioned, very quietly, that the motion sensors had detected movement at the secondary monitoring station that same afternoon, 7 hours after we had installed it. The thermal imaging showed something passing within 20 feet of the camera. The infrared heat signature was unusual. It was cooler than it should have been for a mammal of that size, suggesting either a lower metabolism or a body temperature that was not aligned with normal mammalian physiology. William informed us that we would be implementing night watches. 2 of us would remain at the station at all times, monitoring the equipment and the forest beyond. The other 2 would sleep in rotation. He did not ask if we were willing to do this. He simply stated that it would be done. I volunteered for the first night watch alongside Amanda. William and Ashley would sleep first, with the watch rotating every 4 hours. We sat in darkness, watching the monitors, listening to the ambient forest sounds through the audio system. Hours passed. Nothing happened. The monitors remained empty. The forest was silent. Then, at 2:33 a.m., Ashley appeared in the corridor leading to the sleeping quarters. She did not speak. She simply gestured for Amanda and me to follow her. She led us to the back window of the station, the window that faced the ridgeline where we had installed the secondary monitoring station, and she pointed. Far up the mountainside, in a clearing that was visible only because the tree cover had never grown fully across that particular ridge, there was movement, a shape, massive, standing upright. It was too far away to determine detail, but the size was undeniable. It was twice the height of any human. The shape stood completely still for approximately 30 seconds. Then it raised its head toward the stars, and even from that distance, even in the darkness, we could see its mouth open. We could see it vocalize. And then, from somewhere much closer, from somewhere in the forest just beyond the station, another sound responded, a sound that came from the forest surrounding us. A sound that meant we were not alone. A sound that meant it had been there all along, close enough to watch us, close enough to listen to us, close enough to understand exactly where we were and exactly what we were doing. The next 3 days brought an escalation of activity that William had clearly anticipated but chosen not to discuss in detail until it was already occurring. The motion sensors were triggering multiple times per day. The infrared imaging was capturing heat signatures that moved with deliberate intention, circling the station, approaching the perimeter, then retreating into deeper forest. The audio recordings were filling up storage at an unprecedented rate, every track containing vocalizations, every track containing the evidence of something communicating. Amanda worked almost continuously, analyzing the recordings, attempting to extract meaning from the acoustic data. She began to develop the framework of a possible language structure. High-pitched vocalizations seemed to represent long-distance communication, traveling further through the forest canopy. Low-frequency sounds seemed to indicate close-range interaction, movements within visual range. Mid-range frequencies seemed to serve as responses, confirmations, acknowledgments. It was not a language as humans understood language, but it was structured. It was intentional. It was designed to convey information. William told us that we needed to respond. He said that the creatures understood that we were now aware of them. They understood that we were monitoring them. The vocalizations were not random anymore. They were directed at us. They were attempts to establish communication. We had a choice, he said. We could continue passive observation, which would result in them eventually testing our boundaries more aggressively. Or we could initiate controlled contact, communicating our intentions clearly, and setting the terms of coexistence. I asked him if he had actually communicated with these creatures before. The silence that followed was long enough to be its own confession. He told me that this was not the time to discuss personal history. This was the time to focus on what was happening now. We spent the following day recording communication attempts. Amanda had created a synthesized version of one of the vocalizations, reproduced at a lower frequency to account for the size difference between us and them. William wanted us to play this recording on a speaker system oriented toward the forest, to broadcast our willingness to engage. I asked him what would happen if they responded to our communication by attacking. He told me that they would not attack unless they felt threatened. He said that their intelligence was sophisticated enough to differentiate between curiosity and aggression. The recording was played at dusk. The forest accepted the sound and carried it forward through the trees, diminishing as it traveled outward. We waited. The first response came 23 minutes later, a vocalization from somewhere to the northeast of the station, then another from the southeast. The creatures were triangulating on the sound source. They were determining where the communication was originating from. Over the course of that night, we played multiple recordings. Each time, the responses came faster. Each time, the responses came from closer positions. By the early hours of morning, we had vocalizations coming from what appeared to be all sides of the station. They had surrounded us. Not in an aggressive manner, not moving closer than approximately 200 feet at the nearest point, but surrounding us nonetheless, communicating with each other, responding to our communications, establishing a perimeter. Ashley was frightened. I could see it in the way her hands trembled slightly as she monitored the audio levels. She expressed concern that we might be provoking an escalation that we would not be able to control. William told her that fear was a reasonable response to the unknown. He told her that we were exactly where we should be, doing exactly what needed to be done, and that she should trust in the process. On the fourth day, the motion sensors detected movement at the perimeter fence that surrounded the ranger station. The creature had approached so close that the camera could capture detail. The image was remarkable. The head of the creature filled most of the frame. The face was positioned directly in front of the camera, as if it was examining the lens itself. The intelligence in the eyes was undeniable. This was not an animal operating on instinct. This was something conscious, something aware, something curious about us in the same way that we were curious about it. But the gaze lasted only a few seconds before the creature withdrew. The camera picked up only the motion of it disappearing back into the trees. It was that image that triggered William's request for us to venture into the forest ourselves. He said that we had established a baseline of communication and familiarity. He said that the creatures had demonstrated a controlled approach rather than an aggressive one. He said that the time had come for direct observation, for close-range documentation, for moving beyond the station and into their territory. Ashley refused. She stated directly and without hesitation that she would not be going into the forest to meet with creatures that could crush her with minimal effort. She was adamant. William accepted her refusal without argument. He turned to Amanda and asked if she would accompany us. She agreed, though her agreement carried the quality of someone making a decision that they understood was irrevocable. That left me. William asked if I would go. I remember standing at the window of the station, looking out into the forest, knowing that whatever I said in response would define the remainder of this investigation, and possibly the remainder of my career. I said yes. We prepared with the kind of deliberation that suggested we were about to engage in something far more significant than a simple hiking expedition. William provided us with minimal equipment, cameras with high-sensitivity night vision, audio recording devices, GPS units to mark our location, and emergency communication devices. He told us that we should not bring weapons. He said that weapons would only communicate threat, would only serve to escalate the situation toward violence. I remember thinking that he seemed remarkably certain about the psychology of creatures that should not exist. Ashley prepared detailed maps of our intended route through the forest. We would follow the stream valley where we had discovered the gathering site. We would position ourselves at that clearing during the evening hours when the creatures were most active. We would observe and document. We would not approach them directly. We would not touch them. We would not attempt to feed them or offer any kind of inducement. We would simply be present, bearing witness, and we would allow them to decide how close they were willing to come. The walk into the forest with William and Amanda took us 2 hours. The interior of the forest was different at night than it was in daylight, though I cannot articulate exactly in what manner it was different. The shadows were deeper, the sounds were more distinct. The sense of being watched was not a psychological projection, but a tangible awareness, a knowledge that we were being observed with an intensity that created a physical sensation along my spine and the back of my neck. We reached the clearing as the last light was leaving the sky. William positioned us at the tree line, in a location where we would have clear visibility of the entire meadow while remaining largely concealed by the forest edge. We turned off our flashlights and waited. The first one appeared approximately 40 minutes after we had established position. It entered the clearing from the opposite side, walking on two legs with a gait that was unmistakably humanoid but contained an efficiency and a power that no human could match. The creature was massive, easily 7 feet in height, with a body that was heavily muscled beneath the dense fur covering. The face, when it turned toward our position, bore those same characteristics of intelligence that we had observed in the camera footage. The eyes were aware. The head was held with a posture that suggested cognition. The creature did not acknowledge us directly. It did not approach our position. Instead, it began to make the clearing its location, moving back and forth across the meadow, feeding on something in the vegetation, occasionally pausing to listen to the sounds of the forest around it. Behind it, another creature emerged, then another. We watched as a total of 6 individuals moved through the clearing, their movements coordinated, their presence together suggesting a social structure and a purpose beyond simple survival. Amanda was documenting everything with the camera, recording the images with a precision that I realized was meant to serve as proof, evidence that could not be disputed, footage that would demonstrate conclusively that something impossible was happening in this forest. William was watching with an expression that suggested he was not seeing something new, but rather confirming something he had suspected for a very long time. And I was recording audio, capturing the vocalizations that the creatures were producing, the complex symphony of sounds that seemed to serve as communication between the individuals in the gathering. Then one of the creatures stopped moving. It lifted its head, and though it was facing away from us, I felt certain that it had become aware of our presence. It vocalized, a sound that was different from the others we had recorded, more urgent, more definite, a warning or an alert or a question. The other creatures responded. The vocalizations increased in frequency and intensity. The gathering took on a different character, from peaceful grazing to something else. Awareness, alertness. The creature closest to our position turned and looked directly at the tree line where we were concealed. Its gaze found us with the certainty of someone who knew exactly where to look. I felt my heart rate accelerate. I felt Amanda tense beside me. William, however, remained perfectly still. The creature walked toward us. The movement was deliberate and controlled, crossing the meadow without haste, covering the distance between itself and our position with a power that made my throat constrict. It did not charge. It did not run. It walked as someone walks toward something they wish to examine more closely. It reached the tree line and stopped approximately 15 feet from where we were concealed. It was close enough that we could hear its breathing, close enough that we could see the individual hairs of its fur, the complexity of its eyes, the structure of its nostrils, and the way they flared as it sampled the air. It looked at William, not at Amanda, not at me, but directly at William, with a recognition that was absolute and undeniable. And William looked back. He did not flinch. He did not move. He simply met the gaze with the quality of someone meeting an old acquaintance after many years of separation. The creature vocalized once. A single sound, simple and direct. William responded. He produced a vocalization of his own, using the deep tones that Amanda had identified as close-range communication. The sound was not perfect. It was not native, but it was intelligible. It was attempted communication in a language that was not human. The creature withdrew. It turned and walked back into the meadow, rejoining the others. Within minutes, the entire group had moved back into the forest on the far side of the clearing. We waited in the darkness, but they did not return. The walk back to the ranger station took us 3 hours, though the road should have required only 2. William seemed to be deliberately slowing our pace, ensuring that we took a particular path through the forest. Amanda noticed it as well. When we finally emerged from the tree line, close to midnight, William turned to both of us and told us that there were things about this situation that we would need to discuss privately, away from the station, away from any recording equipment. We did not have that conversation that night. We did not have it the next morning either, because when we returned to the ranger station, we found Ashley alone. She had been alone for the entire duration of our absence in the forest. and she had witnessed something that had changed the entire nature of the investigation. Ashley was sitting in the main office, with all of the monitoring equipment turned off. When we entered, she did not look at us immediately. She was staring at something on the desk in front of her, a photograph, a printed image. When she finally acknowledged our arrival, she simply turned the photograph toward us so that we could see what it depicted. The image was from the primary monitoring station camera, the footage that had been recorded during our absence. The photograph showed the ranger station itself, viewed from the forest, looking inward. And at one of the windows, clearly visible, was a face, a humanoid face. Massive, unmistakably intelligent. It was pressed against the glass, peering into the station, observing the interior with a focused intentionality that could not have been accidental. Ashley told us that the creature had been there for approximately 4 hours during our time in the forest. It had moved around the station, examining all of the windows and doors, testing the barriers, studying the interior with a thoroughness that suggested systematic investigation. It had not attempted to break in. It had not attempted to enter through force. It had simply studied the structure and the equipment within, as if it was learning about us in the same way that we were learning about it. The implications were clear and undeniable. The creatures had not simply tolerated our presence. They had been actively investigating us, learning from us, studying our methods and our equipment, understanding our capabilities and our intentions, and most disturbing of all, they had been making an assessment. William seemed unsurprised by this information. He asked Ashley if she had preserved all of the footage. When she confirmed that she had, he told her that all of the material would need to be compiled and submitted as a formal report to regional headquarters. He said that everything we had documented would be presented as a series of wildlife observations, large, unidentified primate activity, behavioral patterns consistent with emerging hominid groups previously undocumented in this region, evidence of sophisticated social structure and communication capability. He said that we would not use the term Bigfoot. We would not reference cryptid mythology. We would present this purely in scientific terminology and allow the appropriate agencies to make their own determinations about the nature of what we had discovered. I asked him what he intended to do. He told me that he was going to resign from his position. He said that his involvement in this investigation was concluded. He said that there were reasons for this resignation that he could not discuss in an official capacity, but that my instincts about his prior knowledge of this situation had been accurate. He had encountered evidence of these creatures before. He had conducted investigations. He had come to certain conclusions about the nature of coexistence that had motivated his actions in this situation. He told me that I would need to remain as the primary investigator. I would need to file the reports. I would need to ensure that the documentation was submitted through proper channels while remaining aware that proper channels might not process this information in the way that we intended. He told me that I would likely never receive official confirmation about the disposition of the evidence, the analysis of the footage, or the conclusions drawn by whatever agencies received our report. But he told me that I should not interpret silence as disbelief. I should interpret silence as acknowledgement of something that was already known, something that had been observed and documented by prior investigators in prior decades, something that had established a pattern of official non-acknowledgement designed to protect both the creatures and the public from the implications of their existence. Amanda would compile the audio recordings and prepare technical analysis. Ashley would create the photographic documentation and establish a baseline for future monitoring. I would write the formal report, using language that was precise enough to convey the truth while remaining ambiguous enough to survive bureaucratic scrutiny. But there was something else, William told us. There was something that we had not discussed and that we would need to address in the remaining time before he departed. The creatures were not harmless, he said. They were not docile or peaceful or inclined toward human friendship. They were apex predators who had coexisted with humans by maintaining distance and establishing territories. Our investigation, our movement into their gathering site, our communication attempts had altered this arrangement. They had become aware of our awareness. They had demonstrated their intelligence and their capability. And now, William said, they would begin to make decisions about the future of this coexistence. Robert's disappearance took on new significance in this context. William informed us that Robert was likely safe. He told us that the creatures had taken him not to harm him, but to study him, to determine if he was capable of the kind of coexistence that their presence required. He told us that Robert's disappearance was probably temporary, that he would likely be returned once the creatures had completed their assessment, that we should not interpret his absence as a tragedy, but rather as an initiated state within an emerging relationship. I did not believe him. I wanted to believe him, because the alternative was that we had triggered the predatory interest of something that we could not fight and could not escape. But I did not believe him. Ashley asked if we should attempt a rescue, if we should organize a search team, involve state authorities, mobilize the resources necessary to locate Robert and bring him back to human civilization. William told her that any such attempt would be counterproductive. He told her that involvement of outside authorities would only escalate the situation. He told her that the creatures had demonstrated their intelligence through their restraint. They had approached us without violence. They had observed us without aggression. They had made decisions about coexistence that we were only beginning to comprehend. He recommended that we file Robert's disappearance as a routine wilderness incident, exposure to elements, accidental fall, missing person presumed deceased. The machinery of official investigation would activate, would conduct its searches, and would eventually produce a closure that satisfied the need for documentation. But Robert would not be found, William said. Not by any search team, and he would not want to be found. The four of us never spoke directly about any of this again. William departed the station the next morning. Amanda returned to her university with comprehensive data sets that she informed me she would never publish. Ashley requested a transfer to a different region, citing personal reasons that she declined to elaborate upon. And I remained at the ranger station, filing the reports, submitting the documentation, submitting the evidence to whoever was appropriate to receive it. The response from regional headquarters arrived 3 weeks later. A simple notation in my file. Investigation completed. Conclusions inconclusive. Further study not recommended. No additional resources allocated. The case was closed. The evidence was filed. The station would continue normal operations. But normal operations became something different after that investigation concluded. The vocalization stopped. The motion sensors no longer detected activity at the perimeter. The cameras captured only ordinary wildlife. The forest became a forest again, indistinguishable from any other Alaskan wilderness, except for the occasional footprint that appeared along the trails, always 50 or 60 feet into the tree line, always paralleling the marked routes, always suggesting that we were being monitored, observed, and assessed by something that was choosing not to reveal itself. That was 3 years ago. I continue to work this position. I continue to file the reports. I continue to monitor the equipment. I continue to wait for what William said would eventually come, the time when the creatures decide how close they are willing to allow us to come, and what price we will pay for entering their territory. Sometimes, on quiet nights at the station, I still hear the vocalizations, not through the audio monitors, but carried on the wind from the forest beyond the perimeter fence. A sound that I cannot identify to any known animal, but that I hear nonetheless. A sound that seems to contain meaning. A sound that seems to be directed at me. A sound that seems to be waiting for me to understand what is being communicated. I have not understood yet, but I listen every night. Because William told me before he left that understanding is not optional. It is inevitable. And when I finally understand the entire nature of this wilderness, this job, and my relationship with this place will be transformed into something that I cannot currently imagine. Sometimes I am afraid, not of the creatures, but of the understanding, of what it will mean, of what it will require. But I continue to listen. I am a park ranger, and something is hunting my team in Alaska. The communication lines went dead at 11:47 p.m. on a Thursday night in March, and I did not know it yet. But that silence would be the last normal thing I would experience for the next 72 hours. My name is Marcus Webb. I have been a ranger with the Department of the Interior for 19 years, stationed across 3 different regions. But my assignment to Kotzebue felt like a punishment at first. The town sits on the edge of the Chukchi Sea, surrounded by tundra that stretches endlessly in every direction. Winter never truly leaves this place. It merely pauses and retreats into the distance before coming back with renewed fury. The landscape is beautiful in a way that makes you understand why people fear the wilderness. There is nothing to comfort you here. No forests to hide in, no familiar terrain, just white and ice and the constant threat of hypothermia. I had requested this posting after my divorce. I needed distance. I needed to forget. Kotzebue gave me both, but it also gave me something I did not anticipate, the responsibility for an area so remote that the nearest medical facility was 200 kilometers away. In our operations center, which was housed in a converted warehouse on the edge of town, I had only 4 people on my team. 4 people to manage a protected research zone that stretched across more than 1,500 square kilometers of coastal tundra and boreal transition. That Thursday night, I was reviewing incident reports from the previous week. Nothing significant. A wayward tourist had attempted to access a closed trail. A wildlife researcher named Daniel Taylor had submitted his weekly observation logs, as he always did. Taylor was 50 years old and had been contracted by a conservation nonprofit to study animal migration patterns in our region. He was competent, cautious, and in all my interactions with him, he was forgettable in the way that careful people often are. He did his work without drama. The reports were tedious, and by 11 o'clock I was ready to leave the office. Rachel Moore, my assistant ranger, was already gone. She had called in sick earlier that afternoon, something she rarely did. Matthew Jackson, our wildlife technician, was supposed to be conducting a routine monitoring check on the automated camera systems we had installed throughout the zone. He would be out in the field until late, which was standard protocol. At 11:47, my radio crackled. I remember the exact time because I looked at the digital clock on the office wall when I reached for the transmitter. The voice was not Matthew. It was unfamiliar, female, panicked. "Base, this is Research Team Alpha. We have an emergency." "Repeat, we have an emergency." I picked up the radio immediately. "Base here. Identify yourself." "This is Nicole Martin, contracted specialist. We are at grid reference 279er, approximately 12 kilometers northeast of town. There is something out here with us. We need immediate assistance." I knew Nicole Martin. She was a wildlife behavioral consultant, 58 years old, from the Pacific Northwest. She had been working with Daniel Taylor for about 6 weeks on a project related to large mammal activity in the region. I had met her twice at briefings and found her professional and unflappable. She did not sound unflappable now. "Describe the emergency," I said, keeping my voice steady. "There is a large animal. It is not behaving normally. It is circling our camp. We have attempted to make noise and establish boundaries, but it is not responding to standard deterrence. Matthew Jackson is with us. He was delivering a camera unit when this started." Matthew was with them. That was important information. "Has anyone been injured?" I asked. There was a pause. "No, not yet, but it is still moving around us. It is large, very large, larger than anything that should exist in this region based on documented wildlife." I felt something shift in my chest. I did not have a name for the feeling yet. It was a cold tension that made my shoulders tighten. "Can you provide a visual description?" I asked. "It is dark. The moonlight is insufficient. We have spotlights, but they do not illuminate beyond a certain distance. The shape is bipedal. That is not a natural configuration for any known species in this area." Bipedal. That word hung in the air between us like something solid. "Nicole, I am going to initiate emergency protocols. I need you to remain on the radio and keep me updated on the animal's position. Do not attempt to engage it. If it approaches your shelter, retreat to your vehicle immediately." "Understood," she said, and I heard the strain in her voice. "It is moving now. It is moving toward the northern perimeter of our camp." I began making calls. Rachel Moore answered on the second ring, her voice groggy but alert. I told her to get to the office immediately. I called the local police station and requested an available officer to meet me at the ranger station with emergency equipment. I called the hospital and informed them to prepare for potential trauma casualties, though I did not explain why. Then I grabbed my jacket, my sidearm, and a large flashlight that was mounted on a charging dock by the door. As I was leaving the office, I stopped. Something about the situation felt wrong in a way I could not articulate. I turned back and retrieved the heavy-caliber rifle that we kept in a locked cabinet near the back of the storage room. It was not standard equipment for my position. It was there for bear activity, though we rarely had to use it. I had the feeling, standing in that empty office with the radio still active and crackling with static, that I would be grateful I had brought it. By 11:58 p.m., Rachel had arrived at the office. She looked flustered, which was unlike her. She was 35 years old and had worked for the department for 9 years. She had the kind of quiet competence that made the job easier. "What do we have?" she asked. "Unusual animal activity at Grid 279er. Large bipedal creature. Not immediately identifiable." Her eyes widened. "Bipedal?" That is what Nicole Martin reported. Rachel did not say anything for a moment. Then she said, "My grandmother was from this area originally. She moved away when she was young, but she used to tell me stories about something in the tundra, something that walked on 2 legs, something that was not supposed to exist according to official records." I did not know Rachel had family connections to Kotzebue. We had worked together for 2 years, and this was the first time she had mentioned it. "Are these stories relevant to the current situation?" I asked. "I do not know," Rachel said. "But if what Nicole saw is what my grandmother used to describe, then we have something much larger than a wildlife management issue on our hands." At 12:03 a.m., Nicole's voice came through the radio again. Her breathing was heavy. "The animal is no longer circling. It has stopped moving. It is approximately 50 meters from our camp, standing perfectly still. Matthew has a thermal imaging camera. He is attempting to get a reading." "What does he see?" I asked. There was a pause. Then, "It is not there." "What do you mean it is not there?" "I mean," Nicole said slowly, "that there is no thermal signature. The camera sees empty air, but we can hear it breathing. We can hear the sound of its movement in the snow. Matthew swears the camera is functioning properly, but the thermal imaging shows nothing." The hair on the back of my neck stood up. Thermal imaging does not lie. You cannot hide from heat signatures. Mammals generate body heat. It is not optional. Rachel was watching me, and I could see that she understood the implication of what Nicole had just said. "I am on my way," I told Nicole. "Maintain your position. Keep the radio open. Do not turn off your spotlights." I grabbed my coat and headed for the door. Rachel followed without being asked. The drive to Grid 279er took 45 minutes on the frozen access roads that led out into the tundra. Rachel drove while I monitored the radio. Nicole maintained communication throughout, and as we got closer, the edge in her voice seemed to increase with each transmission. The animal, she reported, had moved closer to the camp. It was now only 25 meters away. It had produced vocalizations that she described as low rumbling sounds, almost subsonic. Matthew Jackson had fallen silent. She did not know why he was no longer responding to her questions. That detail troubled me more than I wanted to admit. The landscape outside the vehicle window was monotonously white, illuminated only by our headlights and the vast scatter of stars that was always visible in this region. There was no wind, which was unusual for Kotzebue. On most nights, the Arctic air moved constantly, producing howling that could be heard from inside buildings. Tonight, the silence was profound and unnatural. Rachel drove with her hands at 10 and 2 on the wheel. "My grandmother used to say," she said quietly, "that the thing in the tundra was not supposed to be seen, that if it came close to your camp you were already marked. She said it did not hunt like other animals. It hunted with intention, with purpose." "Purpose implies intelligence," I said. "That was what frightened her the most," Rachel replied. "The idea that something this large, this powerful, could think." The GPS guided us off the main access road and onto a narrower trail that had been created by previous research teams accessing remote monitoring stations. We were now in territory that was truly isolated. It was the kind of place where a person could walk in any direction for kilometers and encounter nothing except tundra. The thought should have been liberating. Instead, it felt suffocating. At 1:04 a.m., we saw the camp lights in the distance. Nicole had positioned several powerful halogen work lights around the perimeter of the research camp, and they cast everything in stark white illumination that made shadows appear impossibly deep. The camp itself consisted of 3 large canvas shelters, a supply tent, and 2 vehicles. As we approached, I could see figures moving inside one of the shelters. We parked approximately 50 meters from the perimeter and exited the vehicle. The cold hit immediately, the kind of cold that makes breathing difficult because the air itself seems to crystallize in your lungs. I had lived in this climate for enough time that I was accustomed to it, but it never became comfortable. Nicole emerged from the nearest shelter as we walked toward the camp. She was wrapped in heavy furs, and her face was marked with the kind of strain that comes from extended periods of fear. Behind her, I could see Matthew Jackson. He was sitting on an equipment box, holding his hands in front of him as though they were injured. "Approximately 2 hours ago," I asked, walking closer. "You reported an animal in this area." "Yes," Nicole confirmed. "Approximately 2 kilometers to the northeast. It was visible in the spotlights initially, though only partially. The image was unclear, but the shape was unmistakable. Bipedal, extraordinarily tall, covered in what appeared to be dark hair or fur." "And now?" I asked. "Gone," Matthew said, speaking for the first time. His voice was hoarse. "Completely gone. We do not see it anymore." I noticed that Matthew would not make eye contact with me. His hands were shaking slightly, and I could see what looked like scratches on his jacket, visible where it had torn at the shoulder. "You are injured," I said, pointing to his shoulder. Matthew looked down as though he was surprised by his own condition. "This happened when we retreated to the shelter. I may have snagged my jacket on one of the tent support posts. It is not serious." It did not look like a snagging injury to me. The tears in the fabric appeared to follow a deliberate pattern, as though something with claws or sharp appendages had raked across his shoulder. But I did not press him on it. "Not yet." "Show me the thermal imaging footage," I said. Matthew and Nicole exchanged a glance that I could not quite interpret. Then Matthew stood and walked to the equipment tent. Rachel stayed close to me as we followed. The tent interior was organized and professional, filled with data collection equipment, computers, and the various tools of their research. Matthew powered up one of the laptops and pulled up a video file. "This was recorded approximately 90 minutes ago," he said. "This is the thermal imaging of the area when the animal was closest to our camp." He played the footage. The screen showed a thermal image of the tundra landscape, with colors representing different heat signatures. I could see the camp structures outlined in warmer tones, and I could see 3 human figures moving within the camp area. There was also a vehicle, illuminated by its engine heat. But in the area where Nicole had described the animal's position, there was absolutely nothing. The thermal signature was not present. It was as though the space was empty of all heat-generating life. "Could this be a malfunction?" I asked. "I checked the calibration immediately after we observed this anomaly," Matthew said. "The equipment is functioning normally. Look here." He pointed to the lower corner of the screen where there were heat signatures of small animals. "We can see the thermal signatures of several small mammals in the background, foxes or similar creatures. The equipment is working perfectly. It is just that the large animal that we clearly heard and observed visually produces no thermal signature." Rachel leaned forward, studying the screen. "That is not possible," she said quietly. "No," I agreed. "It is not." I spent the next 2 hours at the camp, conducting an interview with both Nicole and Matthew. The details of their account remained consistent. They had both heard the animal's approach. They had both seen movement in the spotlights, though the image was unclear due to distance and poor lighting. The animal had appeared massive in size, perhaps 2.5 to 3 meters tall based on their estimates. It had produced vocalizations that they described as unlike anything they had previously encountered. Matthew had deployed the thermal imaging camera as a way to get a clearer understanding of the animal's size and composition. That was when they discovered that the thermal imaging showed nothing. Nicole had suggested retreat to the vehicle, but by that time, the animal had positioned itself between the camp and the parking area. They had instead retreated to the largest shelter, hoping to ride out the encounter until the animal lost interest. After approximately 3 hours of the animal remaining in the vicinity of the camp, it had simply left, departed, vanished into the darkness. Neither of them could explain how it had happened. The animal had simply moved away from the perimeter lights and into the darkness of the tundra, and they had not heard or seen it again. "I want to examine the area around the camp," I said. "I want to look for physical evidence." It was now approaching 3:30 a.m. The sky was beginning to show the faintest signs of the approaching dawn, though it would still be hours before the sun truly rose. Rachel and I took flashlights and conducted a search of the perimeter. The snow around the camp was undisturbed except for the footprints of the research team members. There were no large tracks. There were no signs of any large animal having been in the area. There was, however, something else. On the eastern side of the camp, approximately 30 meters out from the perimeter, I found a tree. It was small, barely more than a sapling, but it had been completely stripped of bark from a height of approximately 2 meters to a height of approximately 4 meters. The tree itself remained standing, but the exposed wood was pale and raw. "What would do this?" Rachel asked, running her hand along the bare wood carefully. "Something very tall," I said, "and very strong." There was no way to estimate the age of the damage. It could have occurred years ago, but the exposed wood did not appear weathered. It appeared fresh. "We need to bring in additional resources," Rachel said. "This is beyond our capability to investigate independently." She was right. I knew she was right. But I also knew that contacting federal authorities would trigger a chain of events that would bring scientists, researchers, and media attention to Kotzebue. It would disrupt the community. It would cause panic. It would also, inevitably, open investigations into whether I had handled the situation appropriately. "Tomorrow," I said. "First light, we document everything. Then we contact the district office." But as I said it, I did not believe it. I knew, with a certainty that I could not explain, that calling for outside help would not solve the problem. Whatever had come to Nicole and Matthew's camp was not a problem that could be solved through official channels or standard protocols. It was something else entirely. Rachel and I did not sleep. Instead, we remained at the camp, maintaining a watch while Matthew and Nicole attempted to rest in one of the shelters. I sat in the warming tent with a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold, and I listened to the sounds of the tundra at night. By 4:15 a.m., something was different. The small animals that had been audible in the background throughout the night had fallen silent. The foxes and any other creatures that inhabited this region seemed to have vanished. The silence was not peaceful. It was oppressive. It was the silence that comes before something happens. The silence that comes when predators move through territory. I stood and walked to the entrance of the tent. Rachel joined me. The spotlights around the camp continued to illuminate the tundra in stark white, casting long shadows that made it impossible to perceive depth. But beyond the light, in the darkness, something was moving. It was subtle at first, a shifting in the shadows, a disturbance in the pattern of darkness that suggested something large was moving through the landscape. Then I heard it, a sound like heavy footsteps in the snow. Not the crunching sound that a human makes, but something deeper. A deliberate placing of weight that seemed to make the ground itself respond. Nicole emerged from the shelter behind me, already awake. She had been listening to the sounds as well. "It is back," she said simply. The footsteps grew closer. I could now hear the breathing that Nicole had mentioned in her radio report. It was not the normal breathing of any animal I could identify. It was rhythmic but somehow irregular, as though the creature was deliberately modulating its breath. "Matthew," I called into the shelter, "wake up and monitor the thermal imaging equipment." He appeared moments later, pulling on heavy clothing as he emerged. His face had gone pale. "It is out there?" he asked. "Yes," I said. "I want to see what the equipment registers." Matthew hurried to the equipment tent. Rachel and I maintained our position at the entrance, watching the darkness beyond the lights. I could see the shape now. It was moving through the peripheral zone where the spotlight illumination faded into darkness. The shape was indeed massive. The proportions were wrong for any known animal. The head was too large, the shoulders too wide, the arms hanging down too long. Matthew's voice came from the equipment tent. "Nothing. The thermal imaging shows absolutely nothing. But the size of it, how is that even?" His voice trailed off. The creature was now completely visible within the spotlights. I had expected to see details of its appearance clearly with such direct illumination. But instead, the light seemed to pass through it in an unusual way. The image was somehow fuzzy despite the clarity of the lighting conditions. My eyes had difficulty focusing on the shape. It was there, visible, unmistakable in its presence, but also somehow obscured, as though it existed slightly outside of normal perception. The creature stood at approximately 3 meters tall. Its body was covered in dark fur or hair that appeared matted and thick. Its face was oriented downward, and I could not see details clearly, but the structure suggested something that was not quite ape and not quite human. The arms were extraordinarily long, reaching down to approximately mid-thigh level when the creature stood upright. The hands appeared to have unusual length and structure, with fingers that seemed too numerous or too elongated for any primate species. It stood at the edge of the spotlights, unmoving, and I realized it was looking at us. The realization that came with that understanding was profound. This creature was not simply wandering through the territory. It was aware of our presence. It was deliberate in its observation of us. It was, in essence, studying us. "Everyone retreat to the largest shelter," I said quietly. "Move slowly. Do not run." We retreated. All of us moved slowly toward the main shelter, and throughout our movement, I could feel the creature's attention on us. I did not look back. I focused on the shelter entrance and kept moving at a steady pace. The instant everyone was inside, Nicole secured the entrance. The shelter was not large, perhaps 5 meters on each side, but it felt marginally safer than being exposed to the open tundra. "What is it?" Matthew asked, his voice trembling. "What is that thing?" "I do not know," I admitted, but Rachel was pale, and she was murmuring something under her breath. I realized she was speaking a language that was not English. It took me a moment to place it. It was Inupiat, the indigenous language of this region, her grandmother's language. "Rachel," I said, "what are you saying?" She looked at me, and her eyes were dark with something that looked like recognition. "It is called the Kiviok," she said quietly, "the thing that walks like a man." My grandmother said the name in a language that predates English, that predates even the word ranger and the word protection. She said it was here when her people first came to this region. She said it was not human, and she said that if you ever saw it, if you ever made eye contact, you were claimed by it. "That is a story," Matthew said, but his voice was uncertain. "Yes," Rachel agreed. "It is a story, but sometimes stories are the only language we have for things that exist outside of science." Outside the shelter, we heard the creature's vocalization again. It was not a roar or a growl. It was something else. A sound that vibrated in your chest and made your teeth ache. A sound that seemed to come from inside your own head as much as from outside. Then there was the sound of claws or something similar raking against the shelter fabric. The shelter shuddered slightly with the force of it. All of us froze. "It is testing the structure," Nicole said, her voice remarkably steady. "It is attempting to determine if the shelter can be breached." The creature continued to circle the shelter, occasionally striking it with what sounded like tremendous force. The tent did not tear, but it swayed with each strike. I realized that the shelter was being tested by something that was consciously attempting to determine its structural integrity. This was not animal behavior. This was something much more deliberate. This was something intelligent. At 5:47 a.m., the attack stopped. The creature did not withdraw gradually. It simply ceased its activity. I heard the heavy footfalls moving away from the shelter, out into the tundra. Within minutes, the sounds had faded completely. We waited in silence for another hour before anyone spoke. The sunrise on that Friday morning came with a clarity that seemed almost cruel. The tundra was revealed in every detail, and there was still no evidence of the creature's presence. No tracks in the snow, no displaced ice, no visible signs of any large animal having been in the area. But something had changed. The temperature seemed to have dropped several degrees, and the snow had a crystalline quality to it that had not been present before. I stood outside the shelter with Rachel and examined the perimeter carefully. There were no gouges in the shelter fabric where I expected to see damage from the creature's strikes during the night. The shelter was completely intact. "It was not trying to enter," Rachel said, following my gaze. "It was something else, a demonstration. A warning." I did not have the luxury of time to contemplate the meaning of the creature's behavior. Matthew's injury, which I had initially dismissed as minor, had begun to show signs of infection. The scratches on his shoulder had started to swell and redden during the early morning hours. I examined them more closely and realized the scratches were inconsistent with any normal laceration pattern. They were too precise, too deliberate. The marks suggested something with multiple sharp points, applied with considerable force. "We need to get him to medical attention," I told Nicole. "His shoulder needs to be examined by a specialist." "There is something else," Matthew said quietly. He was sitting on one of the equipment boxes, and his movements had become slow and deliberate. The night before I came out here to deliver the camera equipment, I was marking the perimeter of the research area with survey posts. I was alone. It was just after dusk, and I had not anticipated being out as long as I was. While I was working, I heard something moving through the tundra. I thought it was a moose or a large caribou, so I did not pay much attention initially. But then I heard something that made me stop. It was breathing. Very close. I turned, and I saw something move through the shadows of the tundra grass. It was tall, much taller than it should have been. "Why did you not report this?" I asked. "Because I was not certain what I had seen," Matthew said. I convinced myself it was a hallucination brought on by fatigue, by the cold. I told myself that if something had actually been there, I would have heard it more clearly. But now, I think something has been watching this area for quite some time. I think I was observed when I was making those survey posts. I think that is how it knew the exact location to come to last night. The implications of this statement were not pleasant to consider. If the creature had been present and observant for an extended period, it might have developed a detailed understanding of the research team's movements, schedules, and routines. This suggested a level of intelligence and deliberate planning that transcended typical animal behavior. I made the decision to evacuate the research team. Rachel drove Matthew and Nicole back to Kotzebue while I remained at the camp to collect the data and equipment they had been working with. I told Rachel to take Matthew directly to the clinic and to ensure that the scratches were properly documented and examined. I also told her to keep the incident confidential for the time being. The last thing I needed was for rumors to begin circulating through the small Kotzebue community about an unidentified creature in the research zone. Once Rachel had departed with the others, I was alone at the camp. The day was clear and cold, with excellent visibility. The sun was beginning its arc across the southern sky, providing approximately 6 hours of direct light. I worked methodically through the research shelters, packing equipment and collecting the data that had been gathered over the past weeks. As I was organizing files, I found something that Nicole had not mentioned during our interviews. It was a notebook, personal observations rather than official research notes. The entries were dated over the previous 3 weeks and contained descriptions of animal behavior that did not align with established patterns. Large movements through the zone at unusual hours, vocalizations at night that did not match known species, and then, approximately 1 week ago, an entry that made me pause, observed what appears to be the same large animal on 4 separate occasions over the past 5 days, positioning itself on high ground overlooking our camp. The behavior pattern suggests intentional observation rather than coincidental presence. The animal does not appear to be hunting. It appears to be watching. Matthew has begun to notice the presence as well, though he does not want to discuss it in detail. Rachel is clearly unsettled, have considered requesting evacuation of the site, but without concrete evidence of danger, the request would not be approved. The final entry was dated 3 days ago and consisted of a single sentence. "I am certain now. It is the same creature each time. It is not random. It is watching us specifically." I closed the notebook and took it with me. This was evidence that needed to be preserved. By the time I had finished collecting the essential equipment and data, it was approaching 2 p.m. The sun was already beginning its descent toward the horizon. I made several trips from the shelters to my vehicle, loading everything carefully. I was focused on the work, and perhaps that is why I did not notice the change in the light until it was nearly complete. The shadows around the camp had begun to behave abnormally. They were not aligned properly with the angle of the sun. They seemed to be oriented toward multiple light sources, as though multiple suns existed simultaneously, and then I realized what was actually happening. The shadows were pointing toward something that was blocking the sunlight, something very tall. I did not turn around immediately. I finished loading the equipment I was carrying into the vehicle and secured the door. Only then did I turn to look back at the camp. The creature was standing approximately 50 meters from the camp perimeter, positioned on higher ground that provided it with an elevated vantage point. In daylight, I could see it more clearly than I had seen it under the spotlights or in the darkness. The revelation was not comforting. It was not entirely corporeal. I do not know how else to describe it. The outline of its form seemed to fluctuate slightly, as though it was not entirely solid. but I could see the fur or hair covering its body. I could see the musculature that was visible through the matted hair. I could see the shape of a face that was oriented directly toward me, and I could see its eyes. They were large, set forward on the face like a predator's eyes, and they were looking directly at me with an intelligence that I could not deny. The creature did not move. It did not approach. It simply stood and looked at me across the expanse of tundra between us. And I understood, in that moment, that Rachel had been correct. I had made eye contact. I had been marked. But I had something that Rachel's grandmother had not considered. I had knowledge and resources. I had documentation of the creature's existence. And I had a responsibility to protect the community of Kotzebue from whatever this thing was. I got into my vehicle and drove directly back to town. As I drove, I could see in my rear mirror a large shape moving parallel to my route, keeping pace at a distance. The creature was following me. It was following me to Kotzebue. Back at the ranger station, Rachel was waiting with Daniel Taylor. He had been located by Rachel after she had completed Matthew's initial medical assessment. The scratches on Matthew's shoulder had been officially documented as a wildlife attack by an unknown large predator. The medical specialist who examined him had suggested bear attack, but even as she said it, I could see the doubt in her eyes. The injury pattern did not match any known bear species behavior. Daniel was remarkably calm as I explained the situation to both of them. He was a man who prided himself on observation and data collection, and he listened to my account without interruption. When I had finished, he was silent for a long moment. "My observations support your narrative," he said finally. "I have been conducting migration research in this region for 8 weeks. 3 weeks into the study, I began documenting the presence of a large animal that did not correspond to any species in the regional database. I attributed the initial sightings to misidentification. Animals that are partially hidden or viewed at distance are often mistaken for larger species than they actually are. But as the weeks progressed, the pattern of observations became increasingly difficult to dismiss." Daniel retrieved his research notebook and opened it to a series of entries and sketches. The sketches were detailed and appeared to be made by someone with training in wildlife illustration. They showed a creature that was indeed bipedal, with unusual proportions and a face that suggested some kind of primate evolution path that did not match any known species. "I have observed it on at least 12 occasions," Daniel continued. "Always at a distance, always in the late evening or early morning hours. Approximately 1 week ago, I observed it standing on an elevated ridge overlooking the research camp. It was stationary for approximately 3 minutes before it moved away. The behavior suggested curiosity rather than predatory intent, but I was disturbed by the intelligence evident in the observation pattern." "Did you make contact?" I asked. "No," Daniel said. "I was approximately 400 meters away when I observed it. The distance was sufficient that I did not perceive myself as being in direct danger, but I did feel observed." Rachel had not spoken during this exchange. She was reviewing the sketches and the notes that both Daniel and I had compiled over the past hours. Finally, she looked up. "The name that my grandmother used," she said quietly, "was not the Kiviak. I was paraphrasing for simplicity. The actual name was much older, something that translates to the one who walks and observes, the one who studies us as we study the land. My grandmother said that it was not evil in the way that people understood evil. She said it was simply other. It operated under different rules, different intentions." "Is it dangerous?" I asked directly. "Yes," Rachel said without hesitation, "but not in the way a bear is dangerous. It will not kill you if you are not a threat to it or if you do not enter its territory. But if it marks you as belonging to its domain, as being subject to observation, then you become part of its interest." "Matthew has been marked," Daniel said. "The injury pattern that he sustained matches the descriptions in the literature regarding the claw marks of large primates. But the precision of the marks, the controlled application of force, suggests something that is not simply attacking a perceived threat." I realized that Daniel was suggesting that the injury to Matthew had been intentional, that the creature had deliberately injured him for a specific purpose. The thought was deeply disturbing. "I need to make a full report to the district office," I said. "We need to bring in federal authorities and specialists who can properly investigate this." "And tell them what?" Rachel asked gently. that we have observed an unknown primate species that produces no thermal signature, exists partially outside normal perception, and appears to be conducting behavioral studies of human beings, they will dismiss us as unreliable or as victims of mass hallucination. Without concrete physical evidence, without a specimen or clear video footage, this becomes a matter of folklore and superstition. She was right, and I hated that she was right. Everything we had documented was circumstantial. The creature's very nature made it resistant to the kind of proof that scientific authorities would require. It was invisible to thermal imaging. It produced no clear tracks. It was somehow difficult to photograph or clearly observe despite its massive size. It was designed to exist outside the boundaries of documented reality. But that did not mean it was not real. I spent the entire evening reviewing every piece of documentation, every photograph, every thermal imaging file that had been collected. I cross-referenced observations with the sketches that Daniel had made. I reviewed the research notes that Nicole had left behind. I compiled everything into a formal incident report. By 11 p.m., I had determined that I would not submit this report through official channels immediately. Instead, I would conduct one additional investigation. I would return to the research zone with specialized equipment. I would attempt to capture visual and physical evidence of the creature's presence, and I would do it alone. Rachel objected strenuously when I informed her of this decision. "This is exactly what it wants," she said. "It is drawing you out. It is making you feel as though you need to respond. You are walking into its territory on its terms." "Then come with me," I said. "Make it less likely that I am being targeted specifically." She refused. She told me that she would not participate in something that was almost certainly going to result in either my injury or worse consequences. But she also told me where to find protection. She gave me a small carving that had belonged to her grandmother. It was made from bone or ivory, and it depicted a figure that was somehow both human and animal. She told me that it was protection against observation, that it would make me less visible to the thing that hunted the tundra. I took it with me, not because I believed it would actually provide protection, but because I needed to do something that felt like it was taking action against the invisible threat that seemed to be closing in around my community. By midnight, I was driving back toward the research zone with a backpack containing a thermal imaging camera of my own, a high-speed video camera, a digital recorder, and several other pieces of observation equipment. I also had the heavy-caliber rifle loaded and positioned within reach. I did not expect to find what I was looking for. I did not expect to succeed in capturing evidence. What I expected was to find an empty research zone and to return to town with nothing, and eventually to file a report that would be dismissed as an isolated incident involving misidentified wildlife. What I did not expect was to find that the creature was waiting for me at the research camp. It was standing in the center of the camp, illuminated by the light of my vehicle's headlamps. It was perfectly motionless, and I realized, as I looked at it, that it was not trying to hide. It was not trying to disguise its presence. It was standing in plain sight, waiting to see what I would do. I turned off the vehicle and sat in silence for approximately 30 seconds. Then I took the high-speed video camera and stepped out of the vehicle. The creature did not move as I began to record. I walked slowly toward it, keeping the camera trained on its form. I was approximately 10 meters away when it turned its head to directly observe me. That was when I understood what Nicole's grandfather's stories had meant by the word observation. This thing was not simply watching. It was recording me in the same way that I was recording it. It was collecting data about my behavior, my reactions, my movements. It was filing away information about who I was and how I responded to its presence. I realized, too, that it had been doing this for longer than the past few weeks. It had been doing this for years, perhaps decades, observing the human presence in its territory, understanding how humans moved and thought and responded, preparing itself for the inevitable moment when confrontation became unavoidable. "I am going to ask you something," I said aloud, "and I do not expect that you will answer, because answering would require language. But I need to know, what do you want?" The creature did not respond verbally, but it moved. It moved with a speed that seemed impossible for something so massive. It closed the distance between us in what felt like an instant, and I found myself facing it from a distance of approximately 2 meters. I did not run. Some primitive part of my brain understood that running would trigger predatory responses. Instead, I held the camera steady and continued to record. The creature's face was now visible in detail through the camera lens. It was not ape. It was not human. It was something in between, something that suggested an evolutionary path that had diverged millions of years ago from the path that had led to modern humans. The eyes were intelligent and dark. The nose was flatter than a human nose, but with more structure than an ape's nose. The mouth held teeth that were neither quite human nor quite primate in configuration. It opened that mouth and produced a sound. It was not a roar. It was not a growl. It was something that existed between communication and pure sound, a vocalization that seemed to carry meaning even if I could not understand the language in which that meaning was expressed. And then it reached toward me. The hand that reached toward me was enormous. The fingers were long and thin, with what appeared to be an extra joint. The claws or nails at the end of each digit were sharp and appeared capable of piercing through flesh and bone with minimal effort. But the touch, when it came, was not violent. The creature simply placed its hand on my shoulder, directly over the spot where Matthew had been injured. The moment the creature made contact, I experienced something that I cannot adequately describe. I saw images, not visions exactly, but information that was being transferred directly from the creature's mind to mine. I saw this region as it had been thousands of years ago, long before humans had established permanent settlements. I saw the tundra as a vast territory that was home to more than one apex predator. I saw a civilization of these creatures, existing in parallel with human civilization, maintaining their distance, maintaining their observation. I saw moments when contact between humans and creatures had become unavoidable. I saw instances of conflict and instances of coexistence. I saw the creatures learning how to hide from human perception, how to make themselves difficult to document, how to exist in the blind spots of human awareness. And then I saw something else. I saw the future. I saw what would happen if external authorities became aware of the creature's existence. I saw hunting parties and capture attempts. I saw the creature, which had existed in this region since before recorded history, being brought to laboratories and research facilities. I saw its death, or something worse than death, a life of captivity and study. The transfer of information ceased, and the creature withdrew its hand. It stepped back, creating distance between us once more. I lowered the camera. I was shaking, not from fear, but from the weight of understanding. I finally comprehended what Rachel's grandmother had known. The creature was not the threat to human civilization. Humans were the threat to the creature's continued existence. I will not, I said slowly, submit documentation of your presence to external authorities. The creature made a low sound, something that might have been acknowledgement or agreement. Then it turned and walked away, moving back into the tundra with a steady, purposeful gait. I watched until it disappeared into the shadows beyond the camp lights. I remained at the research camp until dawn. I reviewed the footage I had recorded. It was unusually clear, more clear than I would have expected given the darkness and the quick succession of events. The images were not ambiguous. They showed clearly the presence of a large bipedal creature with primate characteristics and an upright posture that no known ape exhibited. But when I reviewed the thermal imaging data that I had recorded, it showed nothing. Empty tundra, no thermal signature, no evidence of the presence that the video camera had captured so clearly. I made the decision then. I deleted the video files, all of them. I destroyed the high-speed camera and the recording device. I brought them back to the vehicle and drove to a location approximately 15 kilometers from town, where I disposed of the damaged equipment into a deep ravine. When I returned to the ranger station, I filed an official report that attributed the previous week's incidents to an aggressive bear, likely a grizzly that had wandered further north than its typical range. I recommended additional monitoring and suggested that the research zone be temporarily closed while wildlife specialists assessed the risk level. The report was accepted. Matthew's injury was recorded as a bear attack. The thermal imaging anomalies were attributed to equipment malfunction. Within 2 weeks, a specialized wildlife team had visited the area and found no evidence to support the presence of a large predator. The incident was officially closed, but I knew the truth. And Rachel knew the truth, and Daniel knew the truth, And somewhere in the vast expanse of tundra that surrounds Kotzebue, the creature continued its observation of us, recording data about human behavior, maintaining its existence in the margins of what humans understood to be possible. To this day, I maintain my position as a ranger in Kotzebue. I monitor the wilderness zone where the research camp once stood. I have never documented another direct encounter with the creature since that night, but I know it is still out there. Sometimes, when I am alone in the tundra during the evening hours, I can feel the presence of observation. I know that I am being studied, just as I have studied the land and its wildlife. I know that I made a choice that night to protect something that exists outside the boundaries of official knowledge. I know that choice was necessary, even if it violated the principles that my career is built upon. Some things, I have learned, are more important than documentation and evidence. Some things are more important than advancing scientific understanding. Some things simply deserve to exist in peace, in the vast and wild places of this world that have not yet been fully cataloged and understood by those of us who walk on two legs and believe that everything can be explained. If you are someone who has experienced something similar, if you have encountered evidence of something that does not fit into the categories that we have created for the natural world, I would encourage you to keep your silence. Do not record it. Do not report it. Let it remain in the shadows and the tundra and the wild places of this earth, because the moment you document its existence is the moment you put it in danger. And some things, once destroyed, can never be replaced. Like this episode if you survived the night. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications if you want to hear more from those who work in the wilderness and have seen what we are not supposed to see. Comment below and tell me what you would have done in this situation. Would you have protected the creature, or would you have brought it into the light? There are places in this world where silence carries weight, where it presses down on your chest like a physical thing, making it difficult to breathe. Barrow, Alaska, is one of those places. I have worked these lands for over 20 years. Patrolling the vast stretches of tundra that surround this northernmost city in the continental United States. I have seen things here that most people would dismiss as folklore, as the exaggerations of isolated men with too much time to think. But I know what I have witnessed. I know what walks these frozen plains when the sun disappears for months at a time. What I am about to tell you happened during that period of extended darkness we call polar night. It began in November, and extended well into December, a time when the world outside becomes something altogether different. The air crystallizes, the ground cracks beneath your feet, and something else emerges from the spaces between the visible world. Subscribe to this channel and enable notifications if you want to hear more stories from these northern territories. Leave a comment below letting me know if you believe in what dwells in the places we have forgotten. And please, like this video if you dare. This is what happened in Barrow. This is what I can no longer keep to myself. My name is not important. What matters is that I have walked this terrain for more than 2 decades, and I have earned the right to speak about what lives here. The official title on my credentials reads Park Ranger, though in reality, my jurisdiction extends far beyond any marked trails or designated camping areas. I oversee the vast coastal plains that most people have never heard of, the tundra that seems to stretch forever in every direction during daylight hours, and something far more mysterious during the long darkness. November arrived with its usual harshness. The temperature had already dropped below 30 degrees Fahrenheit when the regular supply helicopter brought unusual visitors. Douglas James was a man in his early 50s, built wide and solid like someone accustomed to physical labor. He had come from Anchorage with the stated purpose of conducting research on Arctic wildlife migration patterns. With him was Carol Watson, a woman of about 50, who introduced herself as his colleague. They were professional enough on the surface, but something about their eyes suggested they were here for reasons beyond the official documentation. They were not alone. Benjamin Brooks, a younger man in his early 40s, arrived with them. He carried expensive camera equipment and claimed to be documenting the project. Judith Kelly, a woman in her late 60s, had come with her own agenda. She spoke little and watched everyone carefully. Charles Sanders, a thin man in his late 50s, was introduced as a specialist in Arctic ecological systems. None of these people were ordinary tourists. None of them were here to observe birds or study moss. The six of us stood in the small building that serves as my station, surrounded by supplies and equipment. Brittany Price, my assistant ranger, was already unsettled by their arrival. She pulled me aside while the others were settling in. "They are not being honest about why they are here," she said quietly. "I have seen enough researchers to know when something does not add up. These people are looking for something specific, something they believe exists in these lands." Brittany was right. She had always been perceptive, and her instincts had never failed us in the past. When we returned to the main group, I addressed them directly. I asked them to tell me precisely what they hoped to find in the Arctic darkness. Douglas James exchanged a glance with Carol Watson. Then he smiled, but the smile never reached his eyes. "We are interested in reports that have circulated for years," he said carefully. "Stories from indigenous communities about large bipedal creatures that leave tracks in the snow. Stories that have been dismissed by mainstream institutions as myth. We think there may be evidence here. Real evidence." He was describing Bigfoot. He was describing the creature that inhabits the spaces of these lands where few humans venture. He was describing something I had encountered before, something I had learned to respect and fear in equal measure. "That is folklore," I said, though both of us knew I was lying. "There is no substantial evidence of such creatures existing here." "Perhaps not," Brittany Price added, her voice level. "But there is certainly something that walks these tundras, something large enough to be dangerous. We have found multiple kill sites over the years, large animals torn apart by something with immense strength." The visitors exchanged glances again. Charles Sanders leaned forward slightly, his interest clearly piqued. Judith Kelly continued to watch us both with an expression of quiet interest. "We would like to include you in our expedition," Douglas James said. "Your knowledge of the land would be invaluable, and if these creatures do exist, they would respect a ranger more than they would respect us." I wanted to refuse. Every instinct in me screamed to keep these people away from what dwells in the darkness beyond our walls. But I also understood that if they were determined to search, they would find their way into the wilderness eventually. At least this way, I might be able to keep them alive. "Very well," I told them, "but you follow my instructions exactly. No exceptions. These lands do not forgive mistakes." We began our expedition on the third day. The sun had not risen for several weeks by that point. We operated in the glow of twilight at midday and complete darkness by late afternoon. The temperatures had plummeted to 15 degrees below Fahrenheit, a cold that transforms your breath into ice crystals and makes exposed skin burn within minutes. The group was equipped with satellite communication devices, emergency supplies, and far too much confidence in their ability to survive what they were walking into. I had insisted on traditional safety protocols, and they had complied, though not without grumbling about how such precautions were excessive for a research expedition. Douglas James led the way with his satellite maps and his theories about habitat preferences for large primates. Carol Watson followed close behind him, checking instruments that I did not recognize. Benjamin Brooks documented everything with his camera, including the moment when Charles Sanders stumbled and nearly fell into a ravine. Judith Kelly moved with the careful precision of someone much younger than her 68 years suggested. Brittany Price and I brought up the rear, watching the group and watching the landscape. It was Charles Sanders who noticed the first tracks. He pointed downward with a trembling hand, and everyone stopped. The prints in the snow were immense. My foot, wearing thick Arctic boots, is just over 12 inches long. Each of these prints measured at least 18 inches from the heel to the end of the longest toe. The spacing between prints suggested a creature of enormous size, and the depth of the impressions indicated incredible weight. "My God," Benjamin Brooks whispered. He was already photographing the tracks from every angle. "It could be a bear," Carol Watson suggested, but her voice lacked conviction. The prints did not match any known Arctic animal. The toe pattern was distinctly humanoid, though scaled up to something that should not exist. "This one is fresh," Judith Kelly observed. She knelt beside the largest impression and held her gloved hand above the surface. "The edges are still crisp. This was made within the last few hours, possibly much more recently." I felt Brittany move closer to me. Her hand found mine, and I squeezed it once to communicate that we would remain alert. The temperature seemed to drop another 10 degrees as we stood in that place, studying the impossible marks in the snow. "We need to follow them," Douglas James said. "This is exactly what we came here for." "We need to return to base," I countered. "We have been here for 4 hours. We have limited daylight remaining, and following unknown tracks in increasing darkness is not advisable." "Just for a mile," Charles Sanders pleaded. "Just far enough to understand the pattern, to see if the creature is traveling with others or alone." Against my better judgment, we followed the tracks. They led us deeper into the tundra, away from the route I had planned, away from the landmarks I had memorized over 2 decades. The prints continued for perhaps 3 miles before they suddenly stopped at a ridge that overlooked a vast plain of snow and stone. There were more tracks here, multiple sets, at least 3 distinct individuals, based on the variation in print size. The largest was even more massive than the first, with prints that might have measured over 2 feet in length. The creatures had paused here for some time, based on the churned snow and the claw marks gouged into the frozen ground. "They were waiting here," Judith Kelly said. "Waiting and watching." "What do you suppose they were watching, Ranger?" I looked in the direction the tracks seemed oriented. My station was roughly 10 miles away in that direction. So was the small native village with its scattering of houses and people. "We return now," I said firmly. "This expedition is over. We pack up whatever instruments you need, and we head back to base immediately." "Just 1 more hour," Benjamin Brooks begged. "I have never been this close to evidence of an undocumented species. This is extraordinary." But even as he spoke, I noticed something that made my entire body go rigid. The light, what remained of it, was fading even faster than expected. And in that fading light, I could see something that the others had not yet noticed. The tracks did not just stop at the ridge. They continued on the other side, descending into a steep valley. But more than that, there were new tracks joining them from multiple directions, at least 5 sets of prints, converging on this location from different paths across the tundra. "They were gathering here," Brittany whispered. "Multiple individuals, coming together for a purpose." "We leave now," I said, and this time my voice carried no room for argument. "This is not research anymore. This is an incursion into territory that we should not be entering. Move quickly, move now." We made it back to the station as the last remnants of twilight disappeared entirely. The Arctic night closed around us like the inside of a tomb. The temperature had dropped to 25 degrees below zero, and the wind carried the kind of cold that seemed to penetrate into your bones and freeze you from the inside out. Everyone was exhausted and shaken by what we had discovered. I ordered hot food and began checking the satellite communication system to ensure we could call for help if needed. Brittany sealed the doors and checked the windows, though I knew that locks and windows would mean nothing if the creatures we were tracking decided they wanted to come inside. "We saw evidence of at least 5 individuals," Carol Watson said as we gathered in the common area. "Multiple adults, possibly a family group or a larger social structure. This suggests they have complex social behaviors, possibly including hunting strategies and territorial organization. It also suggests they were gathering for a specific purpose," Charles Sanders added. "Hunting season, perhaps. A migration ritual. Or something else entirely." Judith Kelly said nothing. She sat near the window, staring out at the absolute blackness beyond the glass. I watched her for a moment and realized that her silence was not the silence of confusion or fear. It was the silence of recognition. She knew something about what we had found. She had known before we arrived. "Judith," I said, addressing her directly, "what are you really doing here? This is not academic research. This is something else entirely." She turned to face me, and for the first time I saw her age. Not her years, but the weight of knowledge that had accumulated over those years. The burden of understanding things that should remain unknown. "I come from a family with deep roots in indigenous communities," she said slowly. "My ancestors lived in these lands for hundreds of generations. They spoke of the old walkers, creatures that existed on the edge of the known world, creatures that were not animals and not quite human. They were territorial, intelligent, and they did not appreciate intrusions into their domain." "You are suggesting these are not undocumented primates," Douglas James said. "You are suggesting something far older, something far stranger." "I am suggesting," Judith Kelly replied, "that whatever exists out there in the darkness has existed for far longer than human civilization has existed in these lands. and I am suggesting that our arrival here, our intrusion into their winter hunting grounds, may have triggered a response. As if in answer to her words, we heard the sound. It came from outside, from somewhere beyond the range of our floodlights. It was not quite a roar, and not quite a howl. It was something between, a sound that seemed to come from deep within the earth itself and reverberate through the walls of our station. It lasted for perhaps 10 seconds, and then it ceased, leaving only the sound of the wind and the violent beating of our hearts. "What in God's name was that?" Benjamin Brooks said, his voice cracking. Brittany grabbed my arm, and I realized my own hands were shaking. I had heard that sound twice before in my 20 years in this land. Both times, it had meant death. Both times, something large had been announcing its presence. Both times, I had ensured that my team remained inside and locked the doors until dawn. "We stay inside," I said. "We do not leave this building. We do not look out the windows unnecessarily. We maintain radio silence. We wait for daylight." "But daylight will not come for weeks," Charles Sanders protested. "The sun will not rise again until January at the earliest. We cannot hide in here for weeks." "Then perhaps you should not have come here," I replied quietly. The night stretched on forever. We sat in shifts, watching the windows and listening to the sounds of the Arctic darkness. Several times we heard movements around the building, scratching sounds at the walls, footsteps that seemed too large to be any normal animal, breathing sounds pressed against the windows, fogging the glass with warmth that contrasted violently with the frigid air outside. Around 3 in the morning, by my watch, we heard something that still haunts me. It was a whisper, an actual human whisper, pressed against the outside of the window where Carol Watson was sitting. It spoke just 4 words, in a voice that sounded almost like it was imitating human speech, with each syllable forming slowly and with great difficulty. "Let us come in," Carol Watson screamed and fell backward away from the window. Benjamin Brooks grabbed her, and Douglas James rushed over to check if anything had damaged the glass. Nothing had. The window was intact, but the frost patterns on the outside of the pane had arranged themselves in a pattern that looked almost like fingerprints, enormous fingerprints, each one the size of my hand. By morning, I use the term loosely because the sky remained pitch black, and there was no discernible difference between night and day. We had not slept. Everyone was running on emergency adrenaline and the remnants of their willpower. The walls of the station felt like they were closing in. Douglas James wanted to leave. He insisted that we call the helicopter and evacuate immediately. Carol Watson supported this decision. Benjamin Brooks seemed torn between wanting to escape and wanting to stay to document what was happening. Charles Sanders was practically catatonic, sitting in a corner and staring at nothing. Judith Kelly continued her vigil at the window, as if she was waiting for something specific. Brittany and I moved around the station, checking supplies and assessing our actual situation. We had food for 3 weeks if we rationed carefully. We had fuel for the heating system for approximately 2 weeks. We had batteries, satellite phones, and emergency supplies. What we did not have was certainty that a helicopter could land safely, or that we would survive the journey if we tried to evacuate on foot. "The creatures are learning," Brittany said quietly as we worked in the kitchen area. "They tested the building last night. They attempted communication. They are assessing their options. This is not random animal behavior. This is deliberate intelligence at work." "I know," I replied, "which means they are deciding whether to attack or retreat. They are evaluating the risk versus the potential reward of whatever they want from us." "And what do they want?" she asked. I did not answer because I was not certain. I had my suspicions, but voicing them would only increase the panic in the station. Judith Kelly approached us as we finished our assessment. She looked as if she had aged years in a single night. The weight of her family's knowledge seemed to have finally settled fully on her shoulders. "My grandfather told me stories when I was very young," she said. "Stories that my parents tried to suppress, that mainstream culture rejected as primitive superstition. He spoke of the Peloyan, as we called them, the old walkers. He said they hunted humans during the dark months, that they considered our kind to be no different from the seals and walruses that provided their primary food source. He said that they maintained a careful balance with our people, hunting us only in limited numbers, never threatening the survival of our communities. But he also said that if we violated their territory, If we showed disrespect to the places they called home, they would respond with fury. "You are suggesting we have violated their territory simply by being here," I said. "I am suggesting that we have done far more than that," she replied. "We have entered the places where they hide their young. We have discovered their gathering sites. We have seen their numbers. We have documented their existence. We have, in essence, declared war on them by creating evidence that proves they exist. In your own files, in this very station, there are records and photographs that will eventually be shared with the wider world. For creatures that have survived millennia by remaining hidden, remaining mythological, we represent an extinction-level threat." "Then what do we do?" Charles Sanders asked. He had quietly moved closer to listen to Judith's words. "Do we simply surrender? Do we allow them to take us?" "We make a choice," Judith Kelly said. "We can attempt to leave and likely die in the process. We can remain here and hope the siege ends, or we can offer them something they want more than revenge." What could we possibly offer? Douglas James had overheard. What could we offer that would satisfy creatures willing to spend weeks surrounding this building? Judith Kelly looked at me, and I understood immediately what she was suggesting. "No," I said flatly. "Absolutely not. I will not allow that." "You do not have to allow it," she replied quietly. "But someone will have to volunteer. Someone will have to walk out that door and face them. Someone will have to offer themselves as the price of everyone else's escape." The station fell into a shocked silence. We all understood what she was proposing. One of us would have to sacrifice themselves. One of us would have to go outside and offer ourselves to the creatures that were waiting in the darkness. Only then might the others have a chance to escape. "My research is worthless," Douglas James said after a long moment. "I came here searching for proof of something that will likely be ignored or rejected by the scientific community anyway. But I came here voluntarily. I can leave voluntarily." "You have a family in Anchorage," Carol Watson said. "You have a wife and 2 children who depend on you. You cannot make this choice, not for research that may never be published." "Then I will go," Charles Sanders said. "I have no family. I have no strong connections anywhere. My life is reasonably expendable." "We do not know if this will even work," Benjamin Brooks protested. "We are operating on folklore and theory. We do not even know if the offer of one life will satisfy whatever is out there." Judith Kelly moved to the window and looked out into the blackness. Outside, we could hear movement, scraping sounds, footsteps, the breathing of multiple large creatures surrounding the station. They were waiting. They had been patient, but their patience was running out. "We will know soon enough," she said. "The darkness is changing. I can feel it. Something is about to happen." It came just after noon, though daylight was non-existent and our watches remained our only reference point. The creatures did not attack gradually or test us further. They simply began. The entire building shook as something enormous struck the eastern wall. Alarms began blaring as the reinforced panels began to flex inward. We rushed to the common area to see the wall visibly bowing under repeated impacts. Douglas James grabbed a fire extinguisher and a metal pipe. Benjamin Brooks did the same. Charles Sanders stood frozen, his moment of bravery apparently evaporating in the face of actual attack. Carol Watson began frantically trying to get a helicopter on the satellite phone, but atmospheric conditions made the connection impossible. "There are too many of them," Brittany shouted over the sound of crashing and breaking. "I can see at least 4 distinct shapes, 4 massive figures striking the building in coordinated attacks." The eastern wall gave way on the 4th massive impact. A section of reinforced wall simply collapsed inward, and cold air rushed into the station like something alive and conscious. In that moment, I saw them for the first time in full. They were nothing like the stories had prepared me for. They were not quite ape, not quite human. They moved with a fluidity and grace that was almost balletic despite their enormous size. Their faces had almost human features, but distorted and stretched into something other. Their eyes held intelligence and rage in equal measure. The largest of the 4, a creature that must have stood 9 feet tall, stepped through the broken wall. Ice and snow clung to its massive frame. Its breath came out in clouds of vapor that filled the station within seconds. Behind it came the others, each one nearly as large, each one moving with terrible purpose. Douglas James and Benjamin Brooks attacked with their makeshift weapons, but the metal pipe simply bounced off the creature's thick hide. The fire extinguisher caused it to pause for a moment, foam coating its face, but it recovered almost immediately. Both men were lifted and thrown across the room with casual brutality. Charles Sanders bolted for a back door. "I volunteer," Judith Kelly said, her voice steady. She stepped directly into the path of the largest creature. "I offer myself freely. Let the others go, and I will submit peacefully." The creature paused. Its massive head tilted slightly as it studied her. The entire building seemed to hold its breath. "We know you," the creature said, its voice like boulders grinding together. "We know your family. Your ancestors walked with respect. You carry their memory in your blood. We will accept this price." Judith Kelly removed her heavy coat and outer clothing. Then she stepped forward and placed her hand on the creature's arm. She did not resist. She did not struggle. She simply walked toward the broken wall, where the other creatures parted to let her pass. "Run," she said over her shoulder, looking at us. "Run now. You have perhaps 5 minutes before they complete what they have come to do and return for the rest of you." We did not need to be told twice. Brittany grabbed my hand and pulled me toward the eastern exit. Douglas James and Benjamin Brooks were already moving, carrying the injured and supporting the shocked. Carol Watson brought up the rear, still holding the useless satellite phone. We ran out into the Arctic darkness, away from the station, away from the creatures, away from Judith Kelly and whatever fate she had chosen for herself. We did not run far. We could not. The cold would have killed us within minutes if we had continued at full speed without proper gear. Instead, we made our way to the emergency cash station, located approximately 1 mile from the main building. It was a small structure, stocked with supplies and emergency equipment, designed exactly for situations like this. Inside, we huddled around the electric heaters and tried to process what had happened. No one wanted to believe that Judith Kelly had deliberately sacrificed herself. No one wanted to accept that her offering had been accepted so readily by the creatures, and no one wanted to consider what might be happening at the main station in our absence. Douglas James attempted to contact the helicopter again, and this time the connection held. We explained the situation, omitting the details about Judith Kelly and the impossible creatures. We claimed that there had been an accident and that we needed immediate evacuation. The helicopter would arrive by late afternoon, they said. Weather conditions were marginal, but they would attempt the rescue. We waited in that small cash station for 6 hours. We did not return to the main station. We did not investigate the sounds we heard approaching and then retreating in the darkness outside. We simply waited and tried not to think about what we had left behind. When the helicopter finally arrived, its lights cutting through the Arctic darkness like knives, we ran toward it. The rotor blades seemed impossibly loud after the long silence. The wind from the propellers threatened to knock us off our feet as we climbed inside. As the helicopter lifted off, I looked back at the landscape below. I could see the main station, still intact, still standing, and around it, I could see movement. Shadows that were far too large to be human, figures that moved with the same fluid grace I had witnessed in the station. They were watching us leave. They were ensuring that we actually departed. They did not pursue. They did not attack. They simply watched until we disappeared into the darkness and the distance. The investigation that followed was perfunctory. The official report cited extreme weather conditions and a structural failure. Judith Kelly had been reported lost in the accident. The others submitted similar stories, omitting the crucial details. Charles Sanders checked into a mental health facility in Anchorage and refused to speak about what had happened. Carol Watson eventually moved to Florida and took a job with a marine research organization. Benjamin Brooks sold his photographs to stock photography agencies as Arctic landscape studies and avoided any discussion of their true origins. Douglas James returned to his original research, but his work shifted focus entirely. He began studying historical records of missing persons in Arctic regions, compiling statistics about how many people vanished in those lands over the centuries. He never published his findings. He said it would cause unnecessary alarm. As for me, I remained. I returned to the station after everything was repaired and restocked. I returned to my duties as park ranger, patrolling the tundra, watching the boundaries between the known world and the hidden places. But I was changed. I began to understand that my role was not to protect the lands from the creatures, but to protect the creatures from the lands, to ensure that humans did not venture too deep, did not discover too much, did not threaten the delicate balance that had existed for millennia. I did not see Judith Kelly again, but I did encounter evidence of her passing. I found artifacts left in specific locations, a piece of fabric, a bone carefully arranged, messages left not for me necessarily, but left nonetheless, as if she was communicating still from whatever place she had gone. Every winter, as the darkness descends and the temperature plummets, I think about that night. I think about the choices we made and the price we paid. I think about the creatures that still walk these lands, that still hunt in the winter darkness, that still maintain their ancient territory against the intrusions of modern civilization. Brittany asked me once if I believed Judith Kelly made the right choice. I told her that it no longer matters whether she made the right choice. It was the choice she made, and it was a choice that saved the rest of us. I continue my patrols. I continue my work as ranger. I watch the lands and I listen to the darkness. And sometimes, in the early hours of the morning, when the wind is blowing just right and the temperature has dropped below 30, I hear that sound again. The roar that is not quite a roar, and the howl that is not quite a howl. The sound of something immense announcing its presence. And I understand that they are still here. They will always be here. And as long as I remain ranger of these lands, they will be safe from the outside world. They will remain the old walkers, the creatures of legend, the beings that should exist only in stories told around fires in villages far from here. That is my purpose now. That is what Judith Kelly's sacrifice purchased for me. And if you are watching this, if you are listening to these words read by artificial intelligence in your own warm and safe home, please understand something. There are places in this world where our kind does not belong. There are creatures that have the right to exist in secrecy and solitude. There are boundaries that should never be crossed. Respect those boundaries. Respect the silence. Respect the darkness and the things that walk within it. Because if you do not, you may find yourself like Judith Kelly, standing in the cold before something immense and ancient, making the kind of choice that haunts you across all the years of eternity that follow. Thank you for listening to this account. Please subscribe to this channel to hear more stories from the frozen north. Leave a comment below and tell me if you believe these lands hold secrets that should remain hidden. And please, like this video if you understand the true meaning of sacrifice. I am the ranger of these lands. This is what I have witnessed. This is what I can no longer remain silent about. The thing about working search and rescue in Alaska is that the mountains do not care about your 30 years of experience. They do not care about your certifications or your protocols or the fact that you have pulled 17 people out of crevasses and ice fields that should have killed them. The mountains are older than you. They are sharper than you. And sometimes, they remind you of this in ways that no training could have prepared you for. My name is Edward Barnes. I am 70 years old, and I have spent the last 4 decades studying the wilderness that surrounds Talkeetna. I know the ridges, I know the valleys, I know where the snow holds weight and where it gives. I know the patterns of wind and water, I know the animals. Or at least, I thought I did. This is what happened during the second week of November, the year before I was planning to retire. The call came through dispatch at 4 in the morning. A family had not checked in from their cabin near Susitna Lake. Nothing unusual about that in itself. Not in November when the days are short and the radio signals grow temperamental. But this family had maintained perfect communication for 18 months. They checked in every evening without fail. When they did not, the protocols engaged like a mechanism I had activated so many times that the motions were second nature. I made the coffee first, dark and strong. Then I pulled up the coordinates for their cabin on the topographic map. Susitna Lake is not far from Talkeetna proper, maybe 35 kilometers northwest through mixed terrain. In good weather, the drive takes 90 minutes, but it was November in Alaska, and good weather is a concept that becomes increasingly theoretical as the season progresses. I called Danielle Ross at the ranger station. She had been working with me for 9 years and had learned not to sound surprised when her radio crackled in the pre-dawn darkness. "I'm already up," she said. "Got the same alert. I'm checking with the family's emergency contacts now." "What do we have?" "Last contact was yesterday at 7 in the evening. Kenneth Jenkins and his wife. They were planning to stay through Thanksgiving. They have 2 adult children who live in Anchorage. Neither one has heard from them since. Kenneth Jenkins, 61 years old. He owned a manufacturing business that he was in the process of retiring from. His wife, Monica Perry, was an architect who had decided to pursue landscape design. They were the type of people who moved to Alaska to achieve a specific vision of themselves, and they usually had the resources to sustain that vision for at least the first couple of years. I had not met them personally, but Danielle had done a welfare check on their property 6 months prior, just to ensure they were properly stocked for the coming winter. "I am heading out," I said. "Can you coordinate from the station and call in Sean Henderson and Diane Coleman? If we need to do ground searches, I want the team ready." Sean was a former mountaineer who had settled in the area 5 years ago. He worked part-time with search and rescue, but maintained his own guiding business. Diane had been doing this work almost as long as I had, though she had taken a 5-year break to raise her daughter. She was sharp and methodical, the type of person you wanted beside you when things started to go wrong. "Already sending out the notifications," Danielle said. "ETA for Jenkins' cabin? Call at 6 o'clock, I said. "I am leaving now." The drive north from Talkeetna is beautiful in any season, but in November, the beauty carries an edge. The trees are dark against the early snow. The light is thin and pale, like old paper. The road itself has begun to deteriorate from the freeze-thaw cycles that will dominate the landscape until spring. My truck is a 2015 Ford, built to handle terrain that would destroy most vehicles. I had maintained it meticulously over the years, knowing that the machine was often the only thing between me and serious trouble. As I drove, I reviewed what I knew about the Jenkins cabin. It was a relatively new structure, built about 4 years prior according to the records. 3 bedrooms, a stone fireplace, modern insulation and heating systems. The kind of place where 2 people could be perfectly comfortable through an entire Alaskan winter, assuming they had adequate supplies and functional equipment. I knew from Danielle's report that they had both. The drive took longer than I had anticipated. A section of the road north of Willow had been damaged by an early frost heave, and the single lane was being managed by a traffic crew. I waited for 20 minutes before being waved through. By the time I turned off the main highway and headed toward the secondary road that led to Sausutna Lake, the sky was beginning to lighten from black to dark gray. The turnoff came at a place where I had turned before, marked by a weathered sign that most people missed if they were not looking carefully. The secondary road is not maintained like the highway. In November it becomes a series of ruts and ice patches, and progress is measured in tenths of a mile rather than miles. My truck handled it without complaint, but by the time the Jenkins cabin came into view, it was nearly 7 in the morning. The cabin was exactly as I had expected from the photographs. A modern log structure with large windows facing south toward the lake, a metal roof, a propane tank mounted on the eastern side, 2 vehicles parked in the cleared area in front of the main entrance, both covered in a light layer of frost and snow from the previous night. Everything appeared normal, which was somehow worse than if something had been obviously wrong. I pulled up beside the other vehicles and turned off the engine. The silence that followed was almost overwhelming. In November, the wilderness around Talkeetna carries a particular quality of quiet, a hushed waiting that makes you acutely aware of how far you are from anywhere that could be called civilization. I sat in the cab for a moment, feeling something that I could not quite name, and then I got out. The air temperature was 19 degrees Fahrenheit. My breath was immediately visible. I pulled my outerwear tight and walked toward the cabin's front door, my boots crunching in the frost and ice. "Kenneth Jenkins," I called out. "Search and rescue. Are you home?" No answer. I tried the door. It was unlocked, which was unusual but not necessarily alarming. People in remote cabins sometimes did not engage locks when they were staying for extended periods. I opened the door slowly and stepped into the interior. The first thing I noticed was the temperature. The cabin was warm, perhaps too warm. The thermostat was set to 73 degrees, and I could feel the heat radiating from the stone fireplace in the living room. The second thing I noticed was the smell, not the sharp smell of decay, which is what I had been unconsciously bracing myself for, but something more subtle. Coffee and wood smoke, and something that I could not quite place. "Kenneth," I called again. "Monica, this is Edward Barnes with Search and Rescue." Again. Nothing. I moved through the main room of the cabin slowly. Everything appeared to be in order. A book lay on the table beside the sofa, marked halfway through. 2 mugs sat on the kitchen counter, both empty, both clean. On the table, I found a note written in what appeared to be Monica's handwriting. "Edward," I said into my radio. "I am inside the cabin. No sign of the residents, no indication of distress or emergency. The place is clean, locked up tight from the inside. I am going to do a more thorough search." Danielle's voice crackled back. "Copy that. Sean and Diane are en route. ETA approximately 1 hour. What I found during the next 30 minutes of searching was something that did not make sense. The cabin was fully stocked with food and supplies. The beds were made. The bathrooms were spotless. There was no sign of struggle or unusual activity. But Kenneth Jenkins and Monica Perry had simply vanished. Sean Henderson arrived first, pulling up in his own truck while I was examining the tire tracks that led away from the cabin's parking area. He had been a climber in his former life, and that calling had never left him. Even at 44, he carried himself with the kind of controlled grace that comes from spending your formative years on the side of mountains. "What are we looking at?" he asked, joining me at the edge of the cleared area. "2 people," I said. 61 and 56. They checked in yesterday evening. They did not check in today. Family is concerned. Cabin was warm and locked from the inside. No obvious signs of distress." Sean crouched down and examined the tracks that I had been studying. There were the tire marks from the Jenkins vehicles, which had not moved in at least 24 hours based on the depth of the frost. But there were other tracks as well. Footprints leading away from the parking area toward the tree line perhaps 50 meters to the north. "How fresh are these?" Sean asked. "Cannot say for certain," I replied. "They could be from this morning. They could be from yesterday. The frost makes timing difficult." What I did not say, but what both of us were thinking, was that the footprints did not have the pattern of human movement. The stride was too long. The depth of the impressions suggested significant weight, but they were spaced in a way that suggested a different gait than anything on 2 legs that I was familiar with. Diane arrived 20 minutes later. She was smaller than both Sean and myself, 5'4". But she moved with the kind of efficiency that suggested she had long since stopped thinking of herself as small. At 56, she carried an old injury from an avalanche rescue gone wrong, a tightness in her left hip that never quite went away, but it did not slow her down. "Cabin is secure," I briefed her as she stepped out of her vehicle. "No signs of violence or emergency inside. Both residents appear to have simply left the property, presumably yesterday evening or night. Danielle is coordinating from the station. I need you two to establish a search pattern. I want to know which direction they went." The 3 of us stood at the edge of the cleared area, looking at the tracks in the frost. Diane had been doing this work since 1989. She had experience that went back further than Sean or myself in terms of raw years, though it came from a different era of search and rescue, before GPS and satellite communication, when you relied on instinct and knowledge and luck. "I do not like those tracks," she said simply. "Neither do I said. "But we start where the evidence is." What I did not tell Diane or Sean was that I had a memory surfacing, something that I had heard years ago when I was new to the work, something that I had dismissed as the kind of folklore that old-timers in remote areas use to keep themselves entertained. We searched the tree line first. The tracks led into the forest, away from the cabin, away from the road, in a direction that had no human settlement for at least 40 kilometers. The snow was not deep enough to make tracking impossible, but it was sufficient to make progress slow. We moved together, maintaining visual contact, using transceivers to stay in communication. "Danielle," I radioed, "we are following tracks northwest from the cabin. The trail suggests the residents moved away from the property voluntarily, unless there is something I am missing." "Copy," Danielle replied. "Kenneth Jenkins' family says he was planning to go on a hunting expedition, minor hunting trip, just north of the cabin. They had mentioned it when they arrived." That made sense and made no sense simultaneously. Hunting at that time of year was possible but unusual. Most people had concluded their hunting seasons by November, but Kenneth was the type who might decide to extend his experience, might want to test himself against the wilderness in a way that most people would not. We followed the tracks for 3 kilometers. The forest grew denser as we moved away from the cabin. The trees were primarily black spruce and birch, with occasional stands of willow. The sky remained gray and featureless. The cold was becoming more intense as the morning progressed. I checked my watch. It was approaching noon. "I am going to call this," I said finally. "We need better light, and we need supplies. This is not a trail that we complete in the next few hours." "What about search dogs?" Sean asked. "If they got lost, a dog could track them faster than we can move on foot." "I am going to request that," I said. "But first I want to understand the pattern. Come back to the cabin. We need to establish a base camp and plan this properly." We returned to the cabin to find that Danielle had already coordinated with the state police and the Alaska State Troopers. A helicopter with thermal imaging capability would be available the following morning, weather permitting. In the meantime, search dogs were being arranged, and a temporary command post was being established at the ranger station in Talkeetna. That night, Sean volunteered to stay at the cabin. I drove back to town with Diane, who was quiet for most of the drive, a sign that she was thinking through something complicated. "Do you remember the stories?" she asked finally, as we pulled into the parking lot at the ranger station. "What stories?" I said, though I already knew. "The ones about Talkeetna, from the 1970s and 1980s, people going missing in the wilderness. The locals used to tell newcomers about it, back when I was working my first tours. They said it was related to something that lived in the mountains." I had heard the stories. Every ranger in Alaska heard them eventually. There were stories about Bigfoot sightings all over the state, particularly in remote regions. Most of them were easily explained. Bears moving on 2 legs, shadows and exhaustion playing tricks on perception. A human mind trying to make sense of something it did not quite understand. "The tracks do not look human," I said. "No," Diane agreed. "They do not." The helicopter arrived at first light, piloted by a specialist named Robert Chen who had logged more rescue hours in Alaska than anyone I knew. The thermal imaging system was state-of-the-art, capable of detecting a human body from altitudes that would have been impossible even 5 years prior. We established a search grid covering a 50-square-kilometer area, centered on the cabin and the trail that Sean and I had discovered. "I am not picking up anything," Robert reported after the first hour of flights. "No heat signatures that suggest human activity, no camp, no shelter, nothing that would indicate 2 people staying in the wilderness overnight." That should have been the moment when we concluded that something terrible had happened, that Kenneth and Monica had fallen into a crevasse or a hidden ravine, that they had become hypothermic and succumbed to the cold, that the wilderness had claimed them, which is what the wilderness does to those who underestimate it. But it was not. By the second day of searching, we had widened the search grid and brought in 3 dog teams. The dogs showed interest in the initial tracks leading away from the cabin, but then became agitated and refused to continue further. The handlers could not explain the behavior. The dogs were experienced search and rescue animals, trained to follow scent trails regardless of terrain or distance. Yet all 3 teams exhibited the same response. They would move forward, then suddenly pull back, ears flat against their heads, as if they had encountered something that their training had not prepared them for. "I have never seen that before," one handler, a woman named Patricia, told me on the evening of the second day. "It is like they recognize a scent that frightens them, but these are not dogs that frighten easily." On the 3rd day, I made a decision that I had been avoiding. I contacted Dr. James Kirkpatrick, a researcher who had spent 40 years studying primate behavior and had published several papers on Bigfoot sightings in the Pacific Northwest and Alaska. He was affiliated with the University of Washington and had made his home in Seattle, but he maintained extensive contacts in Alaska through his research network. "Edward," he said when I reached him by phone, "this is unexpected. I thought you did not believe in folklore." "I do not," I said, "but I believe in evidence. And I need to understand what evidence I am looking at." Kirkpatrick was quiet for a moment. "What exactly did you find?" I described the tracks, the way they deviated from human patterns. I described the behavior of the search dogs. I described the cabin with its locked doors and the residents who had simply vanished. "You need to look for something else," Kirkpatrick said finally. "Look for signs of habituation. Look for repeated patterns. Most of the credible sightings in Alaska have been associated with areas where the animal has developed a territory. They do not randomly take people. They take them because they recognize them, they have observed them. The people involved have done something that has identified them as outside the normal threat parameters. You are suggesting that Kenneth Jenkins and Monica Perry were somehow marked by this creature? I said. I am suggesting that if your evidence is accurate, there is a predictable pattern to what happened to them. And if that is true, then others in the area might also be at risk. I did not like that answer. But I was trained to follow evidence, and the evidence was building into a pattern that I could not dismiss. It was Diane who recognized what I should have noticed from the beginning. She had reviewed the records from the state police database, going back 20 years, looking for missing persons reports in the Talkeetna area that had remained unsolved. There are 5, she said, laying out the files on the desk in the ranger station. 5 people, over 2 decades, who went missing in the immediate vicinity of Susitna Lake in the mountains north of here. 2 in 1997, 1 in 2005, 1 in 2011, 1 in 2014. None of the bodies were ever found. All of them were experienced outdoors people. All of them were missing in autumn or early winter, when the weather was changing. How did I not know about this? I asked. Because each case was treated independently, Diane said. They were not connected in the records. Some were attributed to accident, some remained open, but they are clustered, Edward, geographically and temporally. And I believe I found something else. She pulled out an old newspaper article from the Talkeetna Star newspaper, dated August 1986. The headline read, "Ranger questions increase in remote cabin incidents." This was published by a ranger named Michael Stainbrook, Diane said. He worked in this area in the 1980s. He wrote about a pattern of missing hikers and campers. He suggested that something predatory was active in the region. The article caused some local concern, and then it was effectively ignored. Stainbrook left the service a year later. I found Michael Stainbrook through the state archives. He was 78 years old, living in Juneau, and he was surprised but willing to speak with me. What he described matched the pattern that Diane had uncovered, but with additional context. It was not just people disappearing, he said over the phone. It was people who had begun to establish themselves in the wilderness. Cabin owners, long-term campers, people who were integrating themselves into the ecosystem. And then one day, they would simply be gone. The cabins would be locked from the inside, but the people would have vanished. I tried to raise the issue with my supervisors, but they were not interested. The official position was that people die in the wilderness, and that is sad, but it is not something that requires systematic investigation. I left the service because I could not do my work under those constraints. Did you ever determine what was taking these people? I asked. I had theories, Stainbrook said carefully, but theories are not evidence. What I can tell you is that the pattern stopped in the late 1980s. The incidents simply ceased. Either the creature, if there was a creature, moved on to different territory, or the populations of people in the area declined enough that the interaction stopped. I do not know which. On the evening of the 4th day of searching, I made a decision that I knew would end my career. I wrote a detailed report to my supervisors and the state police, outlining the pattern of missing persons, the tracks, the behavior of the search dogs, and the information provided by Michael Stainbrook and Dr. Kirkpatrick. I did not make conclusions about the identity of whatever was responsible for the disappearances. I simply presented the evidence. The response was predictable and swift. My supervisors arranged a meeting with a specialist from the Department of Fish and Game, a researcher named Lewis Mitchell. He examined my evidence with professional courtesy and then explained to me, with the kind of gentleness that people use when they believe they are speaking to someone who has lost their objectivity, that the evidence was insufficient to support extraordinary conclusions. People disappear in wilderness areas, he said. The tracks could be from a bear. The behavior of the dogs could be explained by several factors. The historical disappearances are correlations, not causations. Without physical evidence, we cannot proceed on the basis of speculation, and that was the end of it. The official search for Kenneth Jenkins and Monica Perry was concluded after 7 days. The case was classified as missing persons, presumed dead, with cause unknown. The search resources were redirected to other tasks. Sean and I continued to search unofficially for another 2 weeks. We did not find anything. Diane volunteered her time as well, but eventually, we all had to accept that if the wilderness had taken Kenneth and Monica, it was not going to return them. I submitted my retirement papers the following month. I was not forced out, but I understood that my credibility had been damaged. I had allowed folklore to contaminate my judgment, and that was something that a professional in my position could not afford to do. But before I left, I did one more thing. I compiled all the information I had collected, including the information from Michael Stainbrook, into a document that I gave to Danielle Ross. I told her to keep it safe and to be aware of the pattern. I told her that if she saw the signs again, if she found another locked cabin with residents who had vanished, she should not dismiss it. "What are you saying happened to them?" Danielle asked me. "I do not know," I said. "I have a theory, but theories are not sufficient. What I know is that something exists in the wilderness north of Talkeetna. What that something is and what it wants, I cannot say with certainty. But I know that it is real, and I know that it is patient, and I know that when people choose to live at the edge of the wilderness, they need to understand what lives at the other side of that edge." 2 years after I retired, I returned to Talkeetna for a visit. It was autumn, and the mountains carried that particular quality of danger that comes at that time of year. I met Danielle for coffee at the small cafe in town, and she told me something that made me understand that my fears had been justified. A new family had moved into a cabin near Susitna Lake. They had bought the property from the state after Kenneth and Monica's disappearance. The family was well prepared and well equipped. They had plans to stay through the winter and then begin a permanent residence the following spring. 3 weeks ago, on a Thursday evening, they had failed to check in with the ranger station. Danielle had made a welfare check. The cabin was warm and secured from the inside. The family was gone. "I found something on the floor," Danielle said. "A letter. It was from Kenneth Jenkins." I felt my breath catch. "He was alive?" "The handwriting was definitely his," Danielle said. "The letter was addressed to whoever might find it." He explained that he and Monica had made a choice. The creature had visited them in the cabin on the night they disappeared. It was not violent. It was curious. It communicated in a way that they could understand, not through words, but through something deeper, through understanding. It had shown them things about itself and about the wilderness. And when it was done, it had asked them a question. Would they stay? Would they choose to remain at the boundary between the human world and the wild? "And what did they answer?" I asked. "According to the letter, they said yes," Danielle replied. Kenneth wrote that leaving with the creature was the most profound choice of his life. He wrote that they had moved beyond human limitations. He wrote that the wilderness had accepted them, and they had accepted the wilderness. But he also wrote that others would come. Others would buy the property and attempt to live at the edge. And he wrote that the creature would continue to visit, continue to ask the question, continue to wait for those who were willing to answer yes. I do not know if that letter was real. I do not know if Kenneth Jenkins was capable of writing such a thing. I do not know if what happened to Kenneth and Monica Jenkins and the family that followed them can be explained by a creature that exists outside the parameters of accepted science. What I know is this. I spent 40 years working as a ranger in the wilderness of Alaska. I earned the trust of the community and the respect of my peers. I followed the protocols. I pursued the evidence. And in the end, I concluded that there are things in the wilderness that humans are not equipped to understand or explain. The wilderness is old. It is deeper than our knowledge. And sometimes, it offers choices to those who venture far enough into its domain. If you plan to move to a remote area, if you plan to build a cabin and attempt to live at the edge of the known world, understand this. You are not alone. The wilderness is watching, and it is patient. It may take weeks, it may take months, it may take years, but eventually, you might receive a visit. You might be asked a question, and the answer you give might change everything. If you have ever felt the pull of wild places, if you have ever wondered what exists in the spaces beyond our civilization, if you have ever asked yourself whether the world contains mysteries that we have yet to comprehend, then please, like this video and subscribe to the channel. Share your own experiences with the wilderness in the comments below. Have you encountered something that defied explanation? We want to hear your story. And if you want to explore more of these narratives, more of these accounts from the edges of human understanding, Then hit that notification bell so you do not miss a single episode. The wilderness is still out there, and it is still waiting.